Section 1. The Secret Life of Springfield's Background Characters. There is a man standing in the background of a crowd scene in Season 3 of The Simpsons. He has no lines. He has no name in the episode itself. He is holding what appears to be a newspaper, and he is looking just slightly off to the left, as though something on the edge of the frame has caught his attention. He was drawn by an animator who has long since moved on to other projects, colored in by someone whose name you will never know, and placed into a crowd of hundreds of similar figures who all exist for the same reason: to make Springfield feel real. And here is the thing about that man: he came back. Not in the same episode, and not in the same scene, but in a later season, in a completely different context, on a completely different street, wearing a slightly different shirt. He appeared again. And if you happen to be the kind of person who watches The Simpsons very carefully, and a surprising number of people would have recognized him. Not because the show told you to. Not because he was given a name or a storyline or a single moment of screen time where the camera acknowledges him, but because he was there, and then he was there again, and your brain quietly filed him away as part of the texture of Springfield. The Simpsons has hundreds of these people. Hundreds of background characters who were created to fill space, who were drawn once or twice and then recycled because the show's animation budget required it, who became familiar through sheer repetition rather than intention. Most of them never developed names. Most of them never developed personalities. They were visual furniture, warm bodies in the crowd, the suggestion of a populated world rather than an actual populated world. But something happened to some of them. Something that the writers didn't plan and the animators didn't expect. A handful of these background characters caught the audience's attention anyway. Not because they were highlighted, not because the camera lingered, but because they were always there, always slightly visible, always just present enough to become part of the architecture of the show. And then, gradually, they became characters, real ones, with names and histories and storylines, and eventually, fans who cared about them more deeply than they cared about some of the main cast. The story of how Springfield's background characters developed into something meaningful is one of the quietest and most interesting creative accidents in the history of American television. And it started, as most interesting things about The Simpsons start, with something going slightly wrong. In the early seasons of the show, the animation was produced by a South Korean studio called ACOM, working from storyboards and design sheets provided by the American production team. The process was functional but imperfect. Characters would occasionally appear slightly different from episode to episode. Background figures would be reused in ways that weren't entirely intentional. The sheer volume of animation required for a weekly primetime show meant that corners were cut in ways that were invisible to most viewers, but obvious to anyone paying close attention. One of those corners was the background population of Springfield. Creating unique, fully realized characters for every person visible in a crowd scene is enormously time-consuming. It is much faster and much cheaper to create a library of generic background figures and rotate them through different scenes. The early seasons of The Simpsons did exactly this. The same half-dozen or so background character designs appeared repeatedly throughout the show's first few years, dressed in different colors, sometimes given slightly different hairstyles, populating the Quick E-Mart and Moe's Tavern and the Springfield Mall and the school hallways with the same borrowed faces over and over again. Most viewers never noticed. The human eye is remarkably forgiving when it comes to background detail, especially in animation. You register the presence of people without cataloging their specific features. The crowd at a baseball game feels real because crowds feel real, not because you have individually memorized every face in the stands. But a few of these recycled background figures were reused so often, in so many different contexts, that even casual viewers began to recognize them. And one of them, more than any other, became something that nobody intended. His name, eventually, became Hans Moleman, though that was not always his name. The character who would become Hans Moleman first appeared in a Season 2 episode as a background figure. He was designed to be a generic, elderly Springfield resident, small and slightly hunched, with thick glasses and a general air of having given up on life some time ago. He had no specific identity and no planned future. He was furniture, but something about him kept making the writers and animators come back to him. There was something about his particular combination of features, the extreme nearsightedness suggested by those thick lenses, the way his proportions made him look slightly compressed, as though life had gradually pressed him downward, that felt inherently comic without requiring any setup. You could put this character in a scene, and something about his presence alone suggested that something unfortunate was about to happen to him. So it did, again and again and again. The first time Hans Moleman experienced serious physical misfortune on the show, it was probably accidental. A background gag that landed harder than expected, something that got a laugh in the writer's room and got remembered for next time. But very quickly, his pattern of suffering became deliberate. Writers began writing him into scenes specifically because putting him in a scene where something went wrong had become a reliable source of comedy. He got hit by things. He fell down. He was crushed by objects of various sizes and descriptions. He was buried. He was incinerated. He walked into traffic in a small, resigned way, as though he had long since stopped being surprised by this kind of outcome. And then he died. Canonically, in a regular episode, not in a dream sequence or a Halloween special. Hans Moleman died, and then, the following week he was back. This should not have worked. Death in a narrative has weight precisely because it is permanent, because it means something, because the absence it creates cannot be filled. You cannot kill a character repeatedly without that weight draining away entirely. The expected result of repeatedly killing the same background character is that it becomes meaningless, a running gag so overexposed that it stops being funny and becomes merely reflexive. But Hans Moleman's repeated deaths did something strange. They became funnier as they accumulated, and then they became something beyond funny. They became a quiet philosophical statement. Here was a man who suffered constantly, who was struck down again and again by the casual indifference of a universe that seemed to have singled him out for punishment, who died and returned without explanation, without acknowledgement, without any character in Springfield stopping to say, "Wait, wasn't he dead last week?" The joke stopped being about the individual deaths and started being about the totality of them, about what it means to keep suffering, about what Springfield's collective refusal to notice says about the town's relationship with tragedy, about whether Hans Moleman's persistence in the face of endless catastrophe is, in some dark way, more heroic than anything the main characters have ever done. The writers eventually gave him a name, then a backstory, then the detail that would become his most memorable characteristic, the revelation, delivered as a throwaway line in a completely unrelated scene, that Hans Moleman is 31 years old. 31. He looks 80. He moves like a man who has been gradually compressed by several decades of misfortune. He is nearly blind, deeply pessimistic, and possessed of the general energy of someone who has already said his goodbyes. And he is 31 years old. This line was intended as a quick gag. The writers knew it would get a laugh, put it in, and moved on. But it opened a door that the show has never fully closed. Because if Moleman is 31, then something happened to him. Something aged him catastrophically, turned a man who should be in the prime of his life into this particular shape of suffering. The radiation theory has an answer for this, as it has answers for most things in Springfield. But the show has never offered one, and the silence around that unanswered question has given Hans Moleman a strange kind of depth that most minor characters never achieve. He became, against all expectation, one of Springfield's most meaningful citizens. Not because the show ever told you to care about him, but because you saw him often enough and his suffering was consistent enough, and the gap between what he was supposed to be and what he had become was wide enough, that caring about him felt like the only reasonable response. This is what background characters can do when a show runs long enough. They accumulate, they develop gravity, they become part of the emotional furniture of a fictional world in ways that feel almost accidental, as though the characters themselves decided to become important rather than being assigned importance from above. The blue-haired lawyer is another one. He has no canonical name. He has been referred to by various nicknames by fans over the years, but the show itself has never settled on one. He appears whenever Springfield needs legal representation on either side of any given dispute, representing Burns one week and opposing him the next, switching allegiances with a fluency that suggests either that Springfield has a very small legal community or that this particular attorney operates on a purely transactional basis with no fixed loyalties. The joke, when the show is being direct about it, is that he is a caricature of the mercenary lawyer, a man who argues whatever position he is paid to argue with the same smooth confidence, regardless of whether he believes a word of it. He is excellent at his job in the narrowest possible sense, which is winning arguments, and completely indifferent to justice in the broader sense, which is the point. But over the course of the show's run, this characterization accumulated enough incidents to become something more nuanced. There are moments where the blue-haired lawyer appears to experience something that looks like genuine discomfort with what he is being asked to do. Moments where the smooth confidence slips slightly, and something underneath it, not conscience exactly, but something in that general neighborhood becomes briefly visible before being suppressed again. The show never develops this thread, never turns it into a storyline, never resolves the implied question of whether he knows he is part of something corrupt and has made his peace with it. But the question hangs there, in the background, just visible enough to make you wonder. Then there is the comic book guy, whose real name, a name so absurd that it exists as its own kind of joke, is Jeff Albertson. The comic book guy began as a one-note character, a caricature of a very specific type of nerd that was emerging as a cultural archetype in the early 1990s. He was obese and dismissive, possessed of encyclopedic knowledge about things that did not matter, and near total contempt for anyone who did not share his interests. His famous catchphrase, "worst episode ever," was a pointed joke about a very particular kind of fan, the kind who treats entertainment as something to be criticized rather than enjoyed, who watches television primarily to catalog its failures. The joke worked. The character worked. But as the seasons piled up, something interesting happened to the comic book guy. He began to accumulate a private life. Details emerged, slowly and without fanfare, that suggested depths beneath the caricature. He had relationships, failed ones, that he discussed with a defensiveness that sometimes cracked into genuine vulnerability. He had opinions about his own life that did not match his opinions about everything else. Where he was merciless in judging fiction, he was gentle and somewhat bewildered when confronted with his own choices. There was an episode where the comic book guy came close to dying of a heart attack in the middle of a passionate argument about Star Wars. And as he sat on the ground, aware that he might be dying, his response was not fear or regret. It was to finish his argument. Because whatever else he was genuine. His obsession was genuine. His contempt was genuine. His investment in things that other people found trivial was as real and as deeply felt as anyone's investment in anything. The show let him survive, because of course it did, but the moment stayed. It said something quiet about the character that the caricature had not said, that there is a kind of integrity in caring deeply about anything, even the things that other people have decided are not worth caring about. Behind the comic book guy's contempt was something that looked, if you squinted, like passion. And passion, even badly expressed, even turned outward as judgment rather than inward as joy, is a form of aliveness that Springfield desperately needs. Dr. Nick Riviera came from a similar place of caricature. He was the bad doctor, the medical school failure who somehow got a license, whose cheerful incompetence was played as broad comedy in the show's early seasons. "Hi, everybody," was his greeting. A line so reliably delivered and so deeply associated with the character that it became one of the show's most quoted non-Bart, non-Homer lines. But Dr. Nick's incompetence was never quite as comfortable as it appeared on the surface, because Springfield has a real hospital, with presumably real doctors, and yet the citizens of Springfield keep going to Dr. Nick. They keep choosing the man who graduated from whatever it is he graduated from, who performs procedures while consulting reference materials he clearly does not understand, who offers medical opinions that are transparently generated from the same source as his patient's desires, rather than from any medical knowledge. Why? The show never fully answers this, but the question is interesting. If you know a doctor is bad, and you keep going to them anyway, something is happening beyond simple ignorance. Maybe the real doctors are too expensive. Maybe they ask too many questions. Maybe Dr. Nick, for all his incompetence, offers something that the real medical establishment does not, which is cheerful acceptance, no judgment, and whatever diagnosis you seem to be hoping for. That is a dark read of a character who is usually played for pure comedy. But it is not an unreasonable one, and the show, in its better moments, seems aware of it. Dr. Nick is funny because he is terrible at his job. But he keeps getting patients because Springfield is the kind of town where being told what you want to hear is worth more than being told the truth. This is the quiet scandal of Springfield's background characters. Not that they exist, but what their existence reveals when you look at them long enough. Each of them was created to fill a function, comedy, atmosphere, the suggestion of a populated world, but the show ran for so long, and returned to these characters so often, that they became something more than functional. They became mirrors. Each one reflecting something specific about the town that contains them, about the systems that created them, about the particular shape of dysfunction that Springfield has perfected over 36 years. The background characters of Springfield are not incidental. They are, in aggregate, a portrait of every person who does not have a name in the credits. Every person who works at a job that does not serve their interests, who participates in a community that does not protect them, who keeps showing up despite everything that has happened, because showing up is what they know how to do. Hans Moleman dies and comes back because Springfield needs him to. Not because the show needs him for comedy, though it does, but because a town built on cycles of disaster and reset needs someone whose experience of that cycle is undeniable. He is the proof of concept. The evidence that the cycle is real and that it is indifferent to the people caught inside it. There is one more background character worth discussing at length, and she is perhaps the most interesting of all precisely because she has so little screen time that most viewers could not pick her out of a lineup. Her name is Brandine Spuckler. She is the wife, or partner, or some legally ambiguous equivalent of Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel, himself a background character who accidentally developed into something much more significant over the course of the show's run. Brandine exists on the furthest margins of Springfield's social world. She is played for comedy, usually comedy of a kind that makes modern audiences uncomfortable, a caricature of rural poverty that the show inherited from a certain strain of American comedy and never quite updated. But here is what is interesting about Brandine. She is, by most reasonable counts, the mother of more children than any other character in the history of the show. Cletus and Brandine have an ever-expanding number of children, usually somewhere between a dozen and several dozen, depending on the episode, most of whom have names that function as punchlines. The show has never given any consistent number. The count shifts from scene to scene, season to season, as though the exact figure is not the point. What is the point, if you choose to look at it as anything more than a running joke about rural fecundity, is the question of what Brandine's life actually is. She is a woman who has spent the entirety of the show's run either pregnant or recently having been pregnant or surrounded by the products of pregnancy, in a context where resources are clearly insufficient, where the infrastructure of the family home is visibly inadequate, and where the broader community of Springfield appears entirely uninterested in what is happening on the edge of town in that particular household. The comedy is supposed to deflect any serious engagement with this, and for most of the show's run it does. But in quiet moments, and there are some, even with Brandine the question insists itself. What would it take for Springfield to notice what is happening to its most marginal citizens? Not just Brandine, but everyone who lives in the spaces the show's camera only visits for a joke? The answer, given everything we know about Springfield, is probably nothing. Springfield has demonstrated, across 3.5 decades, a remarkable capacity for not noticing the things that are most uncomfortable to notice. The three-eyed fish swims past and the town moves on. The cracked cooling towers keep cracking and the town moves on. A man dies in public and comes back the following week and the town moves on. Brandine Spuckler and her uncountable children exist in the margins of Springfield's consciousness for the same reason everything uncomfortable exists there. Because the alternative is paying attention, and paying attention costs something, and Springfield has collectively decided that the cost is too high. That is the quiet scandal of the background characters. They are not hiding in plain sight. They are standing directly in front of you, and you look past them, and Springfield looks past them, and the show looks past them, and then you realize that you have all been doing it together, the characters, the audience, the show itself, and that maybe looking past things is less about not seeing and more about choosing what you are willing to see. Springfield's background is populated with people who deserved more attention than they received. The show knows this. It built them specifically to be overlooked. It made their suffering the punchline rather than the story. And in doing so, it held up a mirror to every real town where the same thing happens, where the people in the background of other people's lives accumulate damage and keep showing up anyway, unremarkable and unremarked upon. The texture of a world that would rather not look too closely at itself. Before we move into the next story, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are right now and what time it is. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that people are listening to this from so many different places, in so many different time zones, late at night or early in the morning, or somewhere in the middle of a quiet afternoon. Let me know. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. There is a lot more Springfield ahead of us tonight. Section 2. The war between the writers, the inside battles that shaped the show. The Simpsons has had more writers' rooms than almost any other show in the history of television. Not more writers' rooms in the sense of physical spaces, but more distinct creative eras, more generational shifts in the people doing the writing, more internal upheaval disguised as business as usual than nearly any comparable program. The show is 36 years old. No human being has been fully present for all of it. Careers began and ended inside those writers' rooms. Friendships formed and fractured. Creative philosophies clashed in ways that never quite made it to the screen, but shaped absolutely everything that did. The story of The Simpsons writers' room is, in many ways, the story of the show itself. And it is a story that the show has never officially told, and that most of the participants have only discussed in fragments, in DVD commentaries, in interviews given years or decades after the relevant events, in memoirs that are sometimes candid and sometimes careful, and sometimes both at once. What follows is that story, assembled from those fragments. The show's writing staff in its earliest seasons was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most unusual collections of talent ever assembled for a television program. The people who wrote the first few seasons of The Simpsons did not come from traditional television backgrounds. Several of them came from Harvard, where they had written for the Harvard Lampoon, a humor magazine that had been producing comedy writers for decades. They were young, they were educated, they were saturated in a specific kind of literary and satirical sensibility that was not the sensibility of typical network television comedy. This created tension almost immediately, because network television comedy in the late 1980s had its own conventions, its own sense of what was funny and what was appropriate and what an audience would accept. And the writers who were shaping The Simpsons early on were, in many respects, contemptuous of those conventions. Not openly hostile, not in a way that would have gotten them fired in the first season, but with a quiet, persistent certainty that they were doing something different, something better, something that operated by different rules. The person most responsible for establishing those rules in the first 3 seasons was a writer named Sam Simon. Simon was one of the 3 credited creators of the show, alongside Matt Groening and James L. Brooks. His contributions to the early Simpsons are enormous and also deeply contested, because Simon and the show parted ways acrimoniously after season 4, under circumstances that have never been fully explained publicly, but that have been described in enough detail, by enough people, to suggest that what happened was not a graceful departure. Simon's position on the show was unusual. He functioned as something like a showrunner, before the term had fully solidified in industry usage, coordinating the writing staff, shaping the overall direction of episodes, making the final calls on what went in and what came out. He was, by many accounts, brilliant at this. He understood comedy structure intuitively, knew how to push writers toward their best work, had a sense of the show's voice that was clear and confident even in its earliest, most uncertain days. He was also, by many accounts, extremely difficult to work with. This is not an unusual quality in talented people who work in high-pressure creative environments. The television writers' room has historically been a place where personality conflicts are not merely common but structurally guaranteed, where strong opinions held by smart people in close proximity under deadline pressure will inevitably produce friction. What makes the Simon situation notable is the particular shape of the friction and what it left behind. The writers who worked on the early Simpsons tell different versions of what the atmosphere was like in those rooms, and the versions depend very much on the teller. Some describe Simon as demanding but fair, someone who pushed them hard because the show demanded it, and who created something genuinely exceptional as a result. Others describe something harder-edged, a more volatile environment, a creative hierarchy that could be arbitrary and that left some writers feeling diminished rather than developed. What is consistent across versions is the quality of the work that emerged from that environment. Seasons 1 through 4 of The Simpsons are widely regarded as among the best seasons of American television comedy ever produced. The writing is sharp, emotionally genuine, structurally precise, and possessed of a tonal range that no animated show had achieved before, genuinely funny and genuinely moving, sometimes within the same scene. After Simon's departure, the show changed. This is where the creative history gets complicated, because the question of whether it changed for better or worse is one that the show's own participants disagree about, and one that the audience has never reached a consensus on, despite 3 decades of arguing about it online. The person who took over in the post-Simon era was a writer named Al Jean, who has since become the longest-serving showrunner in the show's history. Jean's tenure divides roughly into 2 parts: an early period in the mid-90s when he shared duties with Mike Reese, and then a much longer period beginning in the early 2000s that continues to this day. His vision of the show is distinct from Simon's, and the distance between them illuminates something important about what The Simpsons has been at different points in its existence. Simon's Simpsons was, at its core, a show about a family. The comedy was inseparable from genuine emotional investment in the characters. When Homer failed, you laughed, but you also felt the particular weight of a man who wanted things he could not articulate and kept missing them. When Marge struggled, the comedy came from a place of real understanding of what it meant to be a person whose life had not gone as planned and who had decided to love it anyway. The Gene-era Simpsons, particularly in its later seasons, became something different. The emotional weight did not disappear entirely, but it lightened. The character consistency that had defined the early seasons became more flexible. Homer could be a genius in one episode and barely coherent in the next. The town could be destroyed and rebuilt without any memory of the destruction. Storylines that had been carefully developed over years could be quietly set aside when they became inconvenient. This is not a criticism unique to The Simpsons. Most long-running television shows undergo this kind of drift. But The Simpsons' drift was particularly visible because the early seasons had been so precise, so careful, so internally consistent that the loosening felt, to a certain segment of the audience, like a betrayal of something that had been genuinely important. There were writers who left the show during this transition who have since spoken about it, carefully and obliquely, in ways that suggest the creative disagreements were substantive rather than merely personal. The question of what the show should be: comedy, vehicle, or character study, satirical engine or family drama, pop culture commentary or emotional narrative, was a question the writers' room had, at different points, very different answers to. And the show, across its 36 seasons, has been all of those things. Sometimes in the same episode. One of the most significant and least discussed internal conflicts in the show's history involves a writer named Conan O'Brien. Before O'Brien became a late-night host, before he became a celebrity in his own right, he was a writer on The Simpsons in the early 1990s. He was there during the golden era, contributing to episodes that are now considered classics, developing a feel for the show's voice that clearly informed his later career. What is interesting about O'Brien's time on the show is not the work he did while he was there, which was excellent, but the circumstances under which he left. He left to host Late Night on NBC, taking over from David Letterman. This was a significant opportunity and an obvious career move, and the departure seems, from the outside, straightforward. Writer gets opportunity, writer takes it. That is the whole story. Except that the transition was apparently not entirely smooth. People who were present during that period have described O'Brien's departure as emotionally complicated, as the kind of leave-taking that happens when you are genuinely attached to a place and a group of people, and you are not entirely certain you are making the right choice even as you make it. The show threw him a party. There was real warmth. There was also, by some accounts, real grief about the loss of someone whose voice had become integral to the room. O'Brien himself has spoken about his time at The Simpsons with consistent affection, describing it as one of the formative experiences of his creative life. But he has also, occasionally, let slip something that sounds like nostalgia edged with melancholy. The sense that what that room had in those years was something rare and temporary, something that could not be maintained or replicated, that existed for a specific window of time and then was gone. The Harvard connection deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it shaped the show in ways that are subtle but pervasive. The Harvard Lampoon writers who moved through The Simpsons in its early and middle years brought with them a very particular set of references, a very particular comic sensibility, a very particular understanding of what was funny and why. They were steeped in literary parody, in satirical tradition, in the kind of comedy that comes from having read a great deal and having developed strong opinions about most of it. This is not the only kind of comedy that The Simpsons contains. The show also draws heavily on vaudeville, on classic Hollywood comedy, on television history stretching back to the earliest days of broadcast, on the physical and emotional comedy of working-class family life that has nothing to do with literary reference. But the Harvard strand is consistently present, consistently visible in certain episodes and certain moments, and it created a particular texture to the show that distinguished it from everything around it. The tension between the literary satirical comedy and the more grounded character-based comedy is one of the deepest tensions in the show's history. It is visible in the best episodes where both modes are present and each makes the other better. It is visible in the weaker episodes, where one mode dominates at the expense of the other, where the satirical machinery crowds out emotional truth, or where the emotional investment becomes sentimental without the wit to support it. The writers who navigated this tension most successfully are the ones whose work has lasted. Episodes that feel as fresh today as they did in their original broadcast are almost always episodes where both things are happening at once, where you are laughing at a precise observation about American culture and also feeling something genuine about these specific people and what they want. There is another internal conflict that shaped the show's history, one that is rarely discussed in the official accounts. The Simpsons has, throughout its history, had a significant number of female writers, but that number has varied considerably from era to era, and the show's relationship to gender, both on-screen and behind the scenes, has been a subject of ongoing discussion within the industry. In the early seasons, the writing room was predominantly male, which was standard for American comedy at the time. The female characters in the show, Marge primarily, but also Lisa and later others, were written with genuine care and genuine complexity. But that care was being exercised by writers who were, for the most part, imagining their way into experiences they had not lived. Some of the show's most acclaimed character writing involves Marge. The episodes that deal with her frustration, her contained ambition, her love for Homer that coexists with a clear-eyed assessment of his limitations, these are among the show's best pieces of character work. They were written largely by men who understood, intellectually, what they were writing. But there is a difference between intellectual understanding and lived experience, and that difference is occasionally visible in the way the show handles Marge, which can veer between genuine emotional complexity and a certain flattening that happens when you are writing from empathy rather than memory. As the show brought in more female writers over the years, the texture of its female characters changed in ways that are hard to quantify but real. Moments appeared that felt more specific, less theorized, more grounded in the particular quality of female experience in a world that was not built around it. The show has also, across its history, been shaped by writers who came from backgrounds very different from the original Harvard Lampoon cohort. Writers who grew up working class, writers from outside the coastal cultural centers, writers whose connection to the experience of people like Homer and Marge was not satirical sympathy but actual memory. When those writers were in the room, the show had access to a kind of authenticity that the original writers had to construct from research and observation. The result is a show with more layers than most people give it credit for. Not just the obvious layers of satire and parody and pop culture commentary, but deeper layers accumulated from 3.5 decades of different people bringing different things to the room, different memories and different blindnesses and different ideas about what was worth saying. The conflicts between those people never went public in any dramatic way. There was no famous walkout, no writer's room explosion that became industry legend. The internal wars of The Simpsons were conducted at low volume over long periods through the slow drift of creative decisions made in thousands of rooms over thousands of days. But you can see the effects of those wars in the show itself, if you watch it as a whole rather than episode by episode, in the different textures of different seasons, in the particular character moments that land with unusual force in one era and feel hollow in another, in the episodes that feel like someone in the room cared enormously about what was being said, and the episodes that feel like the machine was running without anyone pushing it in any particular direction. The war between the writers was not a war about whether to tell good stories. Everyone wanted that. The war was about what good meant, whether it meant funny or true, whether it meant safe or risky, whether it meant consistent or surprising, whether it meant respecting what the show had been or being willing to break that precedent in service of something new. No one side won that war. You can tell because the show contains evidence of both sides winning at different moments, in different seasons, sometimes in different scenes of the same episode. The Simpsons is a record of that ongoing negotiation, played out over 36 years, between people who all loved the show and all had different ideas about what loving it required. That is the scandal that nobody talks about when they talk about the show's decline, or its occasional resurgence, or its long, strange persistence past any reasonable expectation of continued relevance. The real story is not about the network, or the animation, or the voice cast, or any of the external factors that are easier to point to. The real story is about a group of people in a room, arguing about what to do next, and then doing it, and then arguing again, for 36 years. The work they produced is the record of that argument. Every episode that ever aired was someone's victory and someone else's defeat. Every character choice, every plot decision, every joke that landed and every one that missed, all of it is the sediment of a creative process that was never entirely settled, never entirely comfortable, never entirely resolved. And maybe that is why the show endures. Not despite the tension, but because of it. The Simpsons has always been a show in conversation with itself, arguing about what it is and what it should be and what it owes to the audience and to the characters and to the tradition it inherited and to the future it is building toward. That argument has been going on since before the first episode aired. It has not stopped yet. And as long as it keeps going, the show keeps producing moments where the argument resolves, just temporarily, into something that is both funny and true. Those moments are rarer now than they were in the beginning. But they are still there. And they are still the product of people in a room, disagreeing productively, pushing each other towards something none of them could have gotten to alone. The war between the writers made the show, and the show will carry the evidence of that war forever, layered into every episode, visible to anyone who looks at it long enough with the right kind of attention. Section 3. The celebrity guests who went wrong. The history of celebrity guest appearances on The Simpsons is, by any measure, extraordinary. The show has hosted more famous guests than any other scripted program in television history. Presidents and musicians and athletes and philosophers, astronauts and actors and authors and activists, people who appeared once and became permanently associated with a single joke, and people who appeared so often that they became part of Springfield's extended cast. Most of these appearances went smoothly. The celebrity came in, recorded their lines, the episode aired, and everyone moved on. But some of them went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not in ways that made headlines or ended careers, but wrong in ways that reveal something about how The Simpsons thought about fame, about its own relationship to celebrity, about the peculiar dynamic that occurs when real people enter a fictional world and discover that the fictional world has its own rules. The guest appearance format that The Simpsons developed in its early seasons was elegant in its simplicity. The celebrity did not just appear as themselves playing themselves, they appeared as a heightened version of themselves, a version filtered through Springfield's particular logic, a version that could be funny because it had been given permission to be more itself than reality usually allows. A musician known for being difficult would be allowed to be genuinely, entertainingly difficult. An athlete known for excess would be given license to indulge that excess in ways that their actual public image could not accommodate. This format required a specific kind of participation from the celebrity. They had to be willing to be seen, to let the show take their public persona and push it somewhere uncomfortable, to trust that the writers were doing something interesting with the material rather than simply mocking them. When it worked, it produced moments that felt almost revelatory glimpses of a truth about a famous person that their official image carefully concealed. When it did not work, the results ranged from awkward to genuinely uncomfortable. Michael Jackson's appearance in the third season is the most discussed example of a guest appearance that became complicated by circumstances entirely outside the show's control. In 1991, when the episode aired, Jackson was the most famous person on Earth. He appeared under a pseudonym credited as John J. Smith, in what was, at the time, kept something of a mystery, though it was not really a secret that it was him. He played a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who believed himself to be Michael Jackson, and who connected with Homer in a way that was gentle and surprising and, in the context of the episode, genuinely affecting. The episode was, and remains, one of the best guest appearances the show ever produced. Jackson's participation was enthusiastic and generous. He co-wrote a song for the episode. He clearly understood what the show was doing and engaged with it fully. The result is an episode that stands as a document of a specific moment in popular culture, a moment when Michael Jackson was still, primarily, a symbol of something that felt like magic, before the allegations and the trials and the decades of retrospective reassessment changed the way his image looked. The show eventually pulled the episode from rotation. After the 2019 documentary that detailed allegations against Jackson in more explicit and more damning terms than had previously been available, the show's producers announced that the episode would no longer be broadcast or made available on streaming platforms. The episode still exists. It has not been destroyed, but it has been placed in a kind of informal quarantine, available only to those who know where to look for it. This decision was, and continues to be, debated. The episode's quality is not in question, it is genuinely excellent. The ethics of its continued availability are: when an artwork involves a person whose legacy has been fundamentally altered by serious accusations, what obligation does the institution that owns that artwork have? Is the episode's excellence a defense of its continued circulation, or does the person's conduct override the work's qualities? These are not questions The Simpsons created. They are questions that culture has been wrestling with for years, across many different contexts, with no consensus answer. But The Simpsons occupies a specific position in this conversation because the show is not a private archive. It is public entertainment, watched by children, and the person in question was found by the evidence presented in that documentary, though not by any court to have preyed on children specifically. The producers made their choice. Other people would have made a different one. The conversation is not over. But the Jackson episode is only the most dramatic example of a guest appearance category that deserves more attention, which is the category of appearances where something went quietly wrong that the audience never fully saw. There were celebrities who agreed to appear on the show and then, at some point during the process, became uncomfortable with what they had agreed to. The show has, on a few occasions, animated a guest character without the final voice recording being quite what the writers intended, because the celebrity had second thoughts about certain lines or certain directions, and the final product was a negotiated compromise between what the show wanted to do and what the guest was willing to allow. The show does not publicly discuss these negotiations. The DVD commentaries occasionally hint at them, a writer noting that a particular episode came together differently than expected, or that a certain celebrity's episode went through more revisions than usual. But the full picture of what happens when a famous person sits down with the Simpsons writing staff and realizes that the show's version of them is not entirely the version they wanted to present to the world is not a story that has been officially told. What has been told, in fragments, is that some guests arrived expecting a simple cameo, a joke about their name, a reference to their most famous work, an easy appearance that would associate them with a show that still carried significant cultural prestige, and instead found themselves in the middle of something that was using their public persona to say something they had not anticipated, something that went further than they were comfortable with, something that required them to either commit to the bit or push back and risk being seen as difficult. Different celebrities handled this differently. Some pushed back, some committed. Some found a middle ground that left everyone mildly dissatisfied. The episodes that resulted from these negotiations are sometimes the most interesting of the show's guest appearances because you can occasionally see the seams, the places where the original vision was softened or redirected, where a joke was pulled back to a safer version of itself, where a character choice was modified to accommodate someone's discomfort. There is a category of guest appearances that went wrong, not because of the celebrity's conduct, but because of timing. The show, as a consequence of its production schedule, exists several months ahead of broadcast. An episode that airs in October was written in spring, recorded in summer. This gap creates opportunities for reality to overtake fiction in ways that make a comedic appearance suddenly feel inappropriate. Several episodes have aired in the immediate aftermath of an event that recontextualized them in ways the writers could not have anticipated. A celebrity playing a comedic version of themselves in an episode that aired a month after that celebrity had been involved in a genuine tragedy. A guest character whose storyline touched on a subject that had, in the weeks between recording and broadcast, become something real and painful in the world outside the show. The show has generally handled these moments with quiet pragmatism, sometimes altering episodes before broadcast when time permitted, sometimes allowing episodes to air as intended, and letting the audience navigate the tonal dissonance on their own. One of the most interesting categories of went-wrong guest appearances involves celebrities who appeared on the show when the show's cultural standing was at its height, and who, in hindsight, would probably not make the same decision today. In the early and middle 90s, appearing on The Simpsons was a cultural signal. It said something specific about a famous person, that they were smart, that they had a sense of humor about themselves, that they were plugged into the cultural conversation in a particular way that audiences recognized and respected. As the show's cultural standing evolved as it remained enormously popular but became less urgently relevant, less the thing that defined the conversation, rather than one of many things that participated in it, the meaning of appearing on The Simpsons changed. By the time the show's later seasons were airing, a guest appearance was still a pleasant thing, still a sign of a certain kind of cultural fluency, but it no longer carried the specific prestige it once had. Some celebrities who appeared in later seasons have spoken about the experience with a warmth that is genuine, but that is also slightly different in texture from the way guests spoke about it in the show's heyday. Then, people spoke about it as though they had been admitted to something important. Later, people spoke about it the way you speak about appearing on a long-running show that you respect and enjoy warmly, but without the quality of having been transformed by the experience. This shift is not a scandal exactly, but it is a record of cultural change, of the way an institution's meaning in the culture evolves over time, regardless of the institution's own quality or intention. The Simpsons did not become less good and therefore became less significant. The cultural landscape around it became more crowded, more fragmented, more difficult to dominate, and the show that had once been the definitive American comedy, the place where famous people went to be seen in a specific cultural register, became one of many excellent shows competing for a diminished share of a unified cultural conversation. The guests who appeared in the later years were appearing on The Simpsons, which is still a meaningful thing to do, but they were not appearing on the cultural event that The Simpsons had been. And some of them, you suspect, knew the difference. There is one more went wrong category worth exploring in detail, and it is the most complicated one. Several guest appearances over the years have involved celebrities who were, at the time of their appearance, in the middle of situations that the show either did not know about or chose not to engage with. Situations that were not public knowledge when the recording was done, that became public knowledge later, that retroactively colored the episode in ways that range from uncomfortable to genuinely disturbing. The show cannot be held responsible for things it did not know. That is a reasonable position, and one that the producers have maintained consistently. But the accumulation of these cases creates an odd texture around the show's guest appearance history, a sense that Springfield has, over the years, cheerfully welcomed people into its world whose presence there now requires a certain kind of mental bracketing from the audience. This is, again, not a problem unique to The Simpsons. It is a problem that any long-running entertainment institution faces when enough time passes and enough information emerges about the people who participated in it. The particular quality of The Simpsons' relationship to this problem is shaped by the show's own aspirations. This was always a show that positioned itself as intelligent, satirical, morally engaged with the world it was depicting. It was not supposed to be naive. It was supposed to see things clearly. And it did, often. But it also, occasionally, welcomed people whose conduct it did not see, or whose conduct it chose not to see, and the record of those welcomes is part of the show's complicated history in a way that cannot be edited out without editing out the episodes themselves. What the show does with that record is still being decided. The Jackson episode is one answer. Some appearances remain in rotation without comment. The debate continues, episode by episode, case by case, in the ongoing negotiation between preservation and accountability that every cultural institution of sufficient age eventually has to conduct. The celebrity guest appearances that went wrong are not the most important part of The Simpsons' history. The show is bigger than any of them, but they are honest. They are honest in the way that all unintended records are honest, because they capture something real about the world the show existed in, about the people the show invited into its world, and about the limits of even the most intelligent comedy's ability to see past the surface of things. Springfield welcomed everyone. That was always the joke. And it was always, quietly, the problem. Section 4. The episodes that were banned, buried, or almost never aired. Every long-running show has episodes it would rather not discuss. Episodes that were pulled from rotation, modified after broadcast, or subjected to the kind of careful corporate management that usually means someone, somewhere, has decided that the content in question represents a liability rather than an asset. The Simpsons, with nearly 800 episodes spread across 36 years, has more of these than almost any other show in television history, simply as a function of volume. When you produce that much content over that long a period, some of it will age badly. Some of it will become entangled with events in the real world that change its meaning. Some of it will turn out to have been a bad idea from the beginning, kept alive only by the show's momentum and the trust the audience placed in it. But The Simpsons' buried episodes are interesting not just as embarrassments or oversights. They are interesting as documents. Each one captures something about the moment it was made, about what the writers thought they could say, about what the network allowed, about what the culture was willing to accept in ways that can be read from a distance and understood as something more than a creative mistake. The most consistently discussed example is the episode that depicted a two-character version of the show set in Springfield that was itself set in a real American city. This episode, which was never officially identified as a reference to the city's actual existence in a way that was legally actionable, nevertheless created exactly that legal anxiety in the show's network, which spent several months in discussion with the production team about whether it could air. It aired. But the version that aired was different from the version originally produced, because certain elements were removed or altered in the period between completion and broadcast. This process, episodes being modified after production but before broadcast, or after broadcast but before rerun, or in the process of moving from broadcast to streaming, is something the show has gone through more times than most viewers realize. The digital age has complicated this further, because the version of an episode that someone watches on a streaming platform today may be different in ways large or small from the version that aired when the episode was originally broadcast. Some of these differences are trivial: a piece of music replaced because the licensing expired, a visual gag modified because of a rights issue with the original reference. The kind of technical changes that are invisible to most viewers and irrelevant to most discussions of the show's creative history. Others are not trivial at all. The episode that most consistently appears on lists of episodes the show would prefer did not exist aired in a period when the show was operating at enormous creative confidence and relatively low network oversight, a combination that produced some of the show's best work but also created occasional moments where the show went somewhere that felt, in retrospect, further than it needed to go. The specific episode that is most thoroughly buried in the show's accessible history involves a plotline that, when it was written, was intended as satire of a specific cultural moment that the writers felt was overripe for ridicule. The satirical target was legitimate. The execution was sharper than many of the show's episodes from that period. But the episode contained a specific joke, delivered by a specific character, that landed wrong with a specific segment of the audience in a way that the writers had not anticipated. The joke was not offensive in any obvious way. It did not make light of tragedy, did not demean any group in a straightforward manner, did not cross any of the lines that network standards were monitoring most carefully. But it did something more subtle and, in retrospect, more damaging. It made a kind of comedy out of a situation that was, for some viewers, genuinely painful. Not in a way that was designed to cause pain, but in the way that happens when a joke operates on an assumption about universal experience that is not actually universal. The episode aired. The response was mixed. The network received complaints that were not numerous enough to force an immediate response, but were persistent enough to create a record. The episode was included in the rotation for a few years, then quietly moved to a less prominent position, then effectively de-emphasized in the ways that a streaming platform can de-emphasize things without formally withdrawing them, by removing it from the most accessible categories, by not including it in curated collections, by allowing it to exist without promoting its existence. It is still technically available, but it exists in the same kind of informal quarantine as the Jackson episode, present for those who seek it out, absent from the experience of those who simply watch whatever the algorithm suggests. The episodes that almost never aired are, in some ways, more interesting than the ones that were banned after the fact. These are episodes that cleared every hurdle of production, were written, animated, recorded, edited, and then ran into a wall somewhere between completion and broadcast that nearly stopped them from reaching the audience at all. The most famous example involves an episode from a very successful season that the network executives found, for reasons that have been described in various ways by various people, genuinely alarming. Not alarming in the sense of offensive, but alarming in the sense of feeling too real. The episode in question was a satire of a real cultural situation so precisely observed, so accurately rendered, that the executives who watched it privately were not sure they could defend it publicly. It was not that the episode said something wrong. It was that it said something right in a way that would be impossible to argue with, and arguing with it was going to become necessary the moment it aired. The episode was held. Discussions happened at multiple levels of the network structure. Writers were brought in to explain their intentions. Executives explained their concerns. A compromise was eventually reached, not about the episode's content in any major way, but about its framing, about the way the ending was positioned, about whether the show was making a statement or asking a question. The episode aired with its ending subtly modified. Whether the modification improved it or diminished it is a question the people involved disagree about. The version that aired was strong. The version that was originally produced was, by at least some accounts, stronger. The difference is small enough that most viewers never noticed it. The original version has never been officially released. There are also episodes that were almost pulled for reasons that had nothing to do with their content and everything to do with context. Episodes that were completed and ready for broadcast and that were then held by the network because something happened in the real world. A tragedy, a crisis, a public event that made the network uncomfortable broadcasting what it had planned to broadcast, even though the episode's content had no connection to the real-world event beyond a surface-level tonal similarity. This is a more sympathetic category of pulled episode, because the instinct behind the decision is understandable. When something terrible happens in the real world, scheduling entertainment that seems to be in the same neighborhood as that terrible thing is a decision that can be made to look callous in hindsight, regardless of the actual relationship between the content and the event. Networks are, above all, risk management institutions, and the risk calculation for airing something potentially adjacent to a real tragedy is almost always to hold it. But this caution creates its own problems. Episodes get displaced from their intended broadcast windows and aired later in contexts that do not suit them. Seasonal episodes air out of season. Episodes designed to participate in a cultural conversation air after the conversation has moved on. The show's internal chronology, already complicated by the floating timeline, gets further distorted by decisions made in the machinery of network broadcasting that have nothing to do with the stories being told. One of the most consistently discussed cases involves an episode from the show's middle period that was written in response to a specific public conversation and was ready to air at a moment when that conversation was most active. The network held it. By the time it aired, the conversation had changed. The episode that was supposed to be a timely intervention in something the culture was actively discussing became, by the time it reached the audience, a response to something that had already resolved itself in a different direction. The points the episode was making were still valid, they were just no longer urgent in the same way. The writers on commentary tracks recorded years later discussed this with the kind of philosophical acceptance that people develop when they have been working in television long enough to understand that the relationship between creative work and its cultural moment is always partly outside anyone's control. You write something because the moment demands it. You watch the moment move on without it. You accept that what you made was real even if its window was stolen. The network's role in shaping The Simpsons content is a topic that the show has addressed directly, with some frequency, in its own episodes. The show has made Fox the target of jokes more than once, depicted the network in unflattering terms, given voice to criticism of its programming decisions, made jokes about the network's relationship to its programming that required the network's consent to air, which is a peculiar kind of institutional self-criticism that the show has navigated with more consistency than you might expect. The running joke about Fox scheduling, about the network's willingness to put terrible programming around its best shows, about the corporate philosophy that animated the network's decision-making, these jokes were present in the show from early on and continued well past the point where they seemed to surprise anyone. Fox allowed them, which is either a sign of remarkable corporate self-awareness or a sign that the network correctly calculated that the jokes were good publicity and that the show's audience enjoyed the show's willingness to bite the hand that fed it. But there were limits. The show discovered those limits on more than one occasion, and the episodes that came closest to those limits are among the most interesting in the show's history, not because they are necessarily the best, but because they are the most instructive about the actual boundaries of what the network was willing to allow. The Fox network has gone through significant changes over the show's history, and The Simpsons' relationship to its various owners and operators has been different at different points. The show that existed under one iteration of Fox leadership operated differently from the show that existed under another. The creative freedoms available in one era were not always available in the next. Some things that were allowed became disallowed. Some things that were treated as sensitive in earlier seasons became routine later, as cultural norms shifted and the network's calculations about risk adjusted accordingly. What remains consistent is that the network's involvement in the show has always been more active than the show's public presentation suggests. The Simpsons has always been presented as a show that operates with unusual creative independence, that talks back to its own network, that exists slightly outside the normal commercial logic of television. That presentation is partly true, but only partly. The episodes that never aired, or that aired in modified forms, or that exist in the show's accessible history in ways that are less complete than the versions that were actually made. These are the evidence that the creative independence has always been negotiated, rather than absolute. That the wall between the writer's room and the network has always been permeable. That the jokes about Fox were permitted because they served Fox, not because Fox had surrendered its role in shaping the show. This is not a criticism of the network. Every show exists within institutional constraints, and The Simpsons' institutional constraints have been, by the standards of American network television, relatively generous. The show has done things that other shows could not have done. The show has said things that other shows were not allowed to say. The creative independence has been real even when it has been limited. But the buried episodes, the almost never aired episodes, the episodes that exist in modified forms that are different in small but meaningful ways from what the writers originally made, these are the evidence that the independence had a shape, and the shape was determined by someone other than the writers. That is not a scandal. It is just the reality of making television, which is always a commercial enterprise as much as it is a creative one, and which is always at some level a negotiation between what the people who make it want to say and what the people who broadcast it are willing to allow. The buried episodes of The Simpsons are honest in a specific way. They are honest about the fact that the show's remarkable creative freedom was never unlimited. They are honest about the fact that every act of brave television exists within a structure that determines what brave is permitted to mean. And they are honest about the fact that 36 years of weekly comedy requires, among many other things, a willingness to occasionally accept the loss of something real in order to protect something larger. The writers who made those episodes know what they made. The original versions exist, somewhere, even when they are not accessible. The work was real. The negotiation was real. The gap between what was made and what was shown is, in its own quiet way, also real. And it is part of the show's history even when it is not officially acknowledged as such. Section 5. The Strange and Troubled History of Apu. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon is one of the most discussed characters in the history of American animated television, and the discussion that surrounds him is one of the most uncomfortable that any television show has ever had to conduct about itself in public. It is a discussion about representation and about harm, and about the gap between intention and effect, and about who gets to decide when a joke stops being harmless. It is a discussion that The Simpsons spent years avoiding, then years engaging with inadequately, and then years trying to navigate with varying degrees of success. It is a discussion that has not ended and will not end cleanly because it is about something that does not resolve cleanly. The character of Apu was created in the show's first season as the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart, Springfield's convenience store. From the beginning, he was drawn as an Indian immigrant, specifically, a man from India who had come to America, earned an advanced degree, a PhD, from the Calcutta Institute of Technology, which the show played as both impressive and somewhat absurd, and ended up running a convenience store that he regarded with a particular combination of professional pride and exhausted pragmatism. He was industrious, warm, occasionally morally flexible in the matter of expiration dates, and possessed of a large and cheerfully chaotic family. He loved his community. He was loved by it in return, or at least by The Simpsons specifically, who treated him as a trusted fixture of their neighborhood. He was also voiced by a white man putting on an exaggerated Indian accent, and he embodied, with great consistency and some enthusiasm, a set of stereotypes about Indian immigrants, their accents, their professions, their family dynamics, their religious practices that were, in aggregate, a caricature more than a portrait. For most of the show's first 2 decades, this was not a subject of significant public debate. The show's audience, including significant numbers of South Asian viewers, generally accepted Apu as part of The Simpsons' larger project of exaggerated caricature. Every character on the show was to some degree a caricature. Homer was a caricature of the lazy working-class father. Marge was a caricature of the long-suffering wife. Ned Flanders was a caricature of evangelical Christianity. The show's visual and comedic language was inherently exaggerated, and Apu's exaggeration existed, from this reading, in the same register as all the others. This argument has some validity. The Simpsons is not a realistic depiction of any group. It is a satirical one, and satire requires distortion, requires the amplification of certain qualities at the expense of others, requires the kind of selective emphasis that, applied to any group, produces something that looks like a stereotype even when it is intended as a pointed observation. But there is a distinction that this argument does not fully address, which is the distinction between satirizing the dominant culture and satirizing a minority community. When The Simpsons caricatures Homer Simpson, it is making a joke about a demographic that does not need the show's protection. Working-class white men in America are not a vulnerable population, do not face discrimination based on their class and ethnicity in ways that make comedy about their characteristics potentially harmful. The caricature may be reductive, but it does not contribute to anything that causes real harm. The situation with Apu is different. South Asian immigrants in America have faced, and continue to face, discrimination that is informed by exactly the kind of stereotyping that Apu embodies. They are assumed to own convenience stores. They are assumed to have particular accents. They are assumed to occupy specific social and economic positions regardless of their actual education, background, or individual circumstances. These assumptions have real consequences. They affect how people are treated by employers, by neighbors, by institutions. They produce a flattening of individual identity into a stereotype that is at once familiar and false. When The Simpsons created Apu and ran him as a primary character for 2 decades, it was not creating these stereotypes. They preceded the show by a long time, but it was circulating them, reinforcing them, giving them a cultural presence and a degree of affectionate familiarity that made them easier to reach for rather than harder. It was making the stereotype feel benign. Apu was a good man, a funny man, a man the audience liked in a way that paradoxically made it more entrenched. If you feel warm about a caricature, you are less likely to question whether it is a caricature at all. This is the argument that was made most prominently in a 2017 documentary called The Problem with Apu, directed by and starring Hari Kondabolu, a stand-up comedian who grew up as a fan of The Simpsons and who spent years trying to articulate something about the Apu character that he knew was true but that the culture had not yet found a way to talk about. The documentary was not a polemic. It was thoughtful, often funny, generous toward the show's genuine qualities, while refusing to let those qualities excuse what it identified as a specific harm. The documentary spoke to South Asian Americans who had grown up with Apu as the dominant representation of people who looked like them in American popular culture, who had had the character quoted at them in school, in public, in ways that were not fond, who had grown up navigating the particular indignity of having their ethnicity reduced to a television catchphrase by people who thought they were being playful rather than cruel. The show's initial response to the documentary was, to put it generously, not its finest moment. An episode was produced that addressed the controversy directly, and addressed it in a way that felt less like genuine engagement and more like defensive deflection. The episode showed Marge and Lisa discussing the Apu problem in a meta-fictional scene that ended with Lisa looking directly at the camera and saying something to the effect of, "This is a sensitive topic that we do not know exactly how to handle right now. We will get back to you about it." This response was roundly criticized, including by Hari Kondabolu himself, who noted that the show had responded to criticism about the representation of a minority community by centering white characters and declining to actually address the criticism. The meta-fictional acknowledgement of the problem was deployed in a way that substituted cleverness for responsibility, that used self-awareness as a shield rather than a tool. The show eventually moved toward a different approach. Apu's screen time was reduced significantly in subsequent seasons. Episodes that prominently featured him became less common. The character was not written out, was not killed off, was not given a farewell storyline. He was simply deprioritized, allowed to fade into the background of Springfield in a way that felt less like resolution and more like avoidance. This, too, was criticized. By this point, the criticism was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The community that Kondabolu's documentary represented continued to note that the character's existence was problematic regardless of how much or little screen time he received. A different group argued that reducing Apu's presence was a capitulation to pressure that set a dangerous precedent, that allowing social criticism to affect creative decisions was a form of censorship. A third group noted that the most interesting possible response to the controversy, giving Apu genuine depth, developing his character in ways that pushed past the stereotype. Allowing him to become something more fully human was precisely the thing the show had chosen not to do. The question of voice casting eventually entered the conversation in a more direct way. Hank Azaria, the voice actor who had played Apu since the show's beginning, announced in 2020 that he would step down from the role. This announcement came in the context of a broader cultural conversation about white voice actors playing characters of color in animation, a conversation that the Apu situation had helped to catalyze but that extended far beyond The Simpsons. Azaria's decision was received with the mixed response that complicated gestures of accountability tend to receive. Some people found it meaningful, others found it insufficient, a private acknowledgement of a systemic problem that addressed the symptom rather than the cause. Others found the timing suspicious, positioned as it was in the middle of a broader cultural moment when such gestures were expected and their absence was being noticed. Azaria himself spoke about his decision in terms that were more reflective than most of the official statements around the issue. He acknowledged that he had not previously understood the harm the character caused, that the documentary had changed his understanding, and that he had needed time to process what that change in understanding required of him. He apologized to members of the South Asian community, personally and publicly, in a way that went beyond the corporate statement and into something that felt more genuinely like reckoning. The character of Apu still technically exists within the show's universe. He has not been written out, but he has not been recast, and his role in the show has remained significantly diminished from what it was at the height of his presence. The show has not announced what it will do with the character going forward. The question remains open. What the Apu situation reveals about The Simpsons is something the show's most honest critics have always known. The show's satirical intelligence was genuine. Its satirical reach was limited. It could see clearly when looking at certain things and was genuinely blind when looking at others, and the things it was blind to were not randomly distributed. They correlated, with some consistency, with the difference between depicting the dominant culture and depicting communities that existed outside it. This is not a unique failing. It is the particular shape of a certain kind of liberal satire. Satire that is sophisticated about power structures it understands from the inside and naive about power structures it observes from the outside. The Simpsons understood the working-class white American family from the inside. It understood the media industry, the entertainment world, the academic world from the inside. It understood celebrity and politics and corporate culture from the inside. It understood Apu from the outside. And the view from the outside, however sympathetically rendered, is not the same as the view from within. This is the quiet lesson of the Apu scandal. Not that the show was cruel, not that the creators were malicious, not that the harm was deliberate, but that even very smart, very thoughtful, very satirically intelligent people can produce real harm without intending to, and that the goodness of their intentions does not reduce the harm or make it unnecessary to address. The show produced a character who became a weapon used against real people. It took 20 years to acknowledge this. Its acknowledgement, when it came, was inadequate. The path forward, whatever it is, remains unclear. And the conversation that the Apu situation opened has not closed and will not close, because the questions it raises about who gets represented, and how, and by whom, are questions that American entertainment has been answering inadequately for most of its history, and the answers are not going to improve quickly or easily. The Simpsons is part of that history. Apu is part of that history. And the show's long, uncomfortable reckoning with its own record on representation is part of the record of a culture that is still, slowly and imperfectly, trying to do better. Section 6. The Couch Gag Conspiracy. Hidden messages nobody noticed. The couch gag is the most underestimated element of The Simpsons. Most viewers treat it as exactly what it appears to be: a brief, comedic variation on the show's opening credits sequence, a tradition that exists primarily for variety, a way to prevent the opening credits from becoming monotonous across 800 episodes. The family runs in, something unexpected happens on or near the couch, and then the episode begins. That is the surface. Beneath it is something much stranger, much more deliberate, and in some cases much more significant than anyone has given it sufficient credit for. The couch gag has been running since the show's first episode in 1989. In that original form, it was simple: the family ran in and sat on the couch, and then a brief visual joke was executed, and then the show proper began. The variations in the early seasons were mild. Different numbers of Simpsons appearing on the couch, different configurations, occasional surreal touches that were gentle rather than jarring. Over time, the couch gag evolved into something more ambitious. It became a space where the show could experiment in ways that the episode format did not allow. A space where different visual styles, different comedic registers, different creative collaborators could be invited in to do something that existed in the margins of the show itself, visible, public, but set apart from the narrative by the credit sequence that surrounded it. The couch gag has been directed by guest filmmakers. It has been produced in different animation styles, different visual media, different artistic traditions. It has been used to make pointed observations about the show's own history. It has been used to make pointed observations about the culture surrounding the show. It has, in some cases, been used to say things that the episode that follows it does not say, to set a tone that the network would have been unlikely to permit in the episode proper, to create a brief moment of genuine darkness or genuine beauty before the comedy reasserts itself. The most famous example is the couch gag directed by the street artist Banksy for a 2010 episode. The sequence began normally enough, following The Simpsons through their familiar credit sequence, but when it arrived at the factory where the show's merchandise is produced, a segment of the credits that was itself a departure from the usual format. It depicted conditions that were extraordinary. Animation cells were shown being licked by emaciated workers. Merchandise was being stuffed by children. A kitten was being used as a hole punch. Unicorn horns were being severed for use as DVD spindles. The imagery was pointed, specific, and unflinching. It was a direct commentary on the conditions under which the show's own merchandise and animation was produced, on the labor practices of the global entertainment supply chain, on the gap between the cheerful product and the circumstances of its creation. It aired on Fox. The network that was being directly implicated in the critique allowed the critique to air as part of its flagship show's opening credits. This is extraordinary when you think about it. Not just that the critique was made, but that it was made in this form in the couch gag, in the credits sequence, in the part of the show that most viewers do not think of as a place where anything meaningful happens. Banksy used the couch gag status as marginal space, as the thing before the thing, to say something that would have been far more controversial if it had appeared in an episode proper. The network's decision to allow this was itself a statement. Whether it was a statement of genuine openness to criticism, or a calculation that allowing the critique was better publicity than suppressing it, or simply a failure to fully understand what they were approving until it was too late to stop it. There are different versions of this story, and the official version is not necessarily the most accurate one. What is clear is that the Banksy couch gag created a template. It demonstrated that the couch gag was a space where the rules were different, where things could happen that could not happen in the episode proper, where the show's relationship to its own critique was allowed to be more complicated and more honest than it usually was. After the Banksy couch gag, the couch gag became more deliberately ambitious. More notable directors and artists were invited in. More distinctive visual styles were employed. The range of things that could be done in those 30 to 90 seconds of credit space expanded significantly. But the hidden messages in the couch gags are not only in the spectacular ones. Some of the most interesting are in the ordinary ones, the variations that seem like simple visual jokes but that, examined in context, say something specific about where the show was in a given season, about what the writers were thinking about the anxieties and preoccupations that were present in the room when the episode was made. There is a pattern in the couch gags of the show's middle period that fans have noted and that the writers have neither confirmed nor denied. In seasons where the show was experiencing significant internal turbulence, where there were conflicts in the writers' room, where the network relationship was particularly tense, where the show was publicly under criticism, the couch gags from that period trend darker, more violent in the cartoon sense, more surreal, more likely to depict the family in some state of distress or dissolution. This could be coincidence. It could be projection, the human tendency to find meaning in patterns that are actually random. But it could also be what it looks like a creative outlet for the show's own anxieties, a space where the pressures of the production could be acknowledged in a form that would be read as playful rather than confessional. The couch gag from the season where the show faced its most significant internal creative upheaval depicts the family arriving on their couch to find that the couch has been replaced by something different, something that does not recognize them, something that treats them as strangers in their own home. The visual is played for comedy and it is funny, but it is also, if you know what was happening in the production at the time, something else. The couch gags that use alternative animation styles are worth examining more carefully than they usually receive. When the show departed from its house style for the couch gag using stop motion, or computer-generated imagery, or a deliberate approximation of a children's book illustration style, it was doing something more than showing off. It was making an argument about the show's relationship to other creative traditions, about the way The Simpsons existed in dialogue with the history of animation and visual storytelling that preceded it. Some of these departures were deeply affectionate love letters to specific traditions, executed with care by people who clearly knew the traditions they were working in. Others were more ambivalent, more complex, suggesting not just affection for the reference but a kind of questioning of it, a willingness to use the borrowed style not just to celebrate it but to examine what it assumes and what it leaves out. The couch gag that perhaps says the most about the show's self-image is one that does not use an alternative style at all, that stays entirely within the show's own visual vocabulary. In this couch gag, the usual opening credits sequence is followed all the way to the couch, but when the family arrives, the couch is surrounded by decades of previous couch gags, represented as a kind of archaeological layering, the earliest versions of the joke visible beneath the later ones, the whole history of the opening compressed into a single image that shows, simultaneously, where the show began and what it had accumulated. This couch gag aired in a milestone season, and its explicit subject was the show's own duration. But its implicit subject was something more interesting, the question of whether accumulation is the same as progress, whether 30 years of variations on the same joke represents creative vitality or creative exhaustion, whether the pileup of history is a source of richness or a weight that eventually becomes impossible to carry. The couch gag could not answer this question. Couch gags are not built for answers, only for questions posed in comic form, but it asks the question clearly, which is more than most anniversary celebrations manage. There is a subgenre of couch gag that deserves its own category, which is the couch gag that functions as a visual prediction. Not in the mystical sense that the show's prophecy mythology has attached to certain episodes, but in the more mundane sense of a creative team trying something visually that later became standard practice in animation or visual design. Several couch gags from the show's middle period used compositional and motion design choices that were unusual at the time, but that have since become common. These are not predictions exactly. They are evidence of creative leadership of a show that was formally inventive enough that its experiments occasionally preceded the mainstream. What makes this interesting is that the couch gag is where this inventiveness was usually housed, not the episodes, which were subject to production constraints and narrative requirements that limited formal experimentation. The couch gag, brief and self-contained and already understood to be a space for variety, was where the show's visual imagination could most freely operate. The conspiracy theory version of the couch gag, which circulates in certain corners of the internet, suggests that the couch gags encode specific messages intended for specific audiences, that certain visual elements, when decoded, reveal information about upcoming storylines, about the show's creative direction, about the relationships between characters in ways that the episodes themselves never state directly. This theory is almost certainly not true in the way its proponents describe it. The couch gags are not designed as cryptographic messages. The show does not embed secret information in its opening credits for a select audience to decode. But the theory exists because the couch gag space has clearly been used for more than pure comedy. Something is being communicated in those gags, even if it is not the specific thing that conspiracy theorists have decided it is. An emotional temperature, an artistic ambition, a record of where the show was and what it was thinking about and what it was worried about at a given moment. The couch gag is the show's unconscious. Not in the clinical sense, but in the creative sense, the place where things appear that do not quite fit anywhere else, that are not fully processed, that exist in the space between what is said and what cannot be said directly. Every episode has a stated subject. The couch gag has whatever the writers needed to say that did not fit into the episode proper. Over 36 seasons, that accumulation of unsaid things, expressed in 10 to 90 seconds of visual comedy before the credits finish, is itself a kind of record, a record of the show's private self, its concerns and anxieties and ambitions and fears, expressed in the one space that was always available, always visible, and almost never taken seriously enough to warrant careful attention. The couch gag rewards careful attention, not because it reveals secrets in the way conspiracy theorists imagine, but because it is honest. briefly, weakly in the margins of the show that contains it. The couch gag says what the show is really feeling. And 36 years of those feelings, accumulated and layered and expressed in the language of visual comedy, is a document that deserves more serious consideration than it has received. Section 7. The real people behind Springfield's darkest characters. One of the most consistent open secrets in the history of The Simpsons is the degree to which its characters are based, at least in part, on real people. This is not unusual for comedy. Almost all comedy characters draw on real-world models, the writer's observations of actual people, the exaggeration of real qualities into fictional extremes. What makes The Simpsons unusual is the consistency with which the show has drawn on specific, identifiable individuals in creating some of its most memorable and most troubling characters. Matt Groening has discussed this to some degree in various interviews. The show's creator has acknowledged that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, and that many of the town's street names and geographic features are drawn from his childhood in Portland. He has acknowledged that Homer and Marge Simpson take their names, though not their personalities, from his own parents. He has spoken about the degree to which his own experience of American family life informed the show's emotional core. What he has discussed less, and what the people who have worked on the show have discussed in the careful, oblique language that comes from years of non-disclosure agreements and professional loyalty, is the degree to which specific characters were drawn from specific real people in the entertainment industry, in the network, in the circles of power and money that surrounded the show during its production. Mr. Burns is the character most often discussed in this context. He is, by design, a composite figure not based on any single person, but assembled from a collection of archetypes about unchecked wealth and institutional power that the show's writers observed over years in the entertainment industry. The writers have said as much, publicly, and there is no reason to disbelieve them. But there are specific Burns qualities, specific behavioral tics, specific patterns of interaction, specific moments in the show's Burns storylines that former employees of various entertainment institutions have described, in conversations that are sometimes on record and sometimes off it, as uncomfortably familiar. The particular quality of a powerful man who cannot remember the names of the people who work for him, not because he is senile, but because he has decided their names are not worth retaining. The specific dynamic of a workplace where the source of power is arbitrary, where the person at the top is capable of sudden generosity that is indistinguishable from cruelty, where the competent second in command manages the relationship between the powerful man and the rest of the world through a combination of devotion and damage control. These dynamics are recognizable to anyone who has worked in a certain kind of organization. They are not unique to Burns or to any single real person. But the specificity with which they are rendered in the show's best Burns episodes suggests that at least some of the people in the writer's room had direct experience of them, not merely theoretical familiarity. Ned Flanders presents a different kind of origin question. He is on the surface a caricature of a very specific kind of American evangelical Christianity, the kind that presents its faith with such determined cheerfulness that it reads, from the outside, as performance rather than genuine feeling. This caricature was drawn from a rich cultural tradition of satirizing American religiosity, and Flanders contains elements of many real and fictional religious archetypes. But the detail about Flanders' childhood, the revelation that his relentless goodness is the product of behavioral conditioning, that his niceness is a cage built by a psychiatrist to contain the violence underneath, is specific enough and strange enough that it does not feel like simple satire. It feels like something that was observed, perhaps not in its exact form but in something close to it, by someone who understood from experience what it means to have your emotional range systematically narrowed by someone who convinced themselves they were helping. The show has, deliberately and with genuine craft, populated Springfield with characters whose darkest qualities are specific rather than generic. And specificity in character writing usually comes from one of two sources, either extraordinary imaginative empathy or direct observation. The Simpsons' best writers had both, and the characters they produced are compelling precisely because you cannot always tell which source a particular detail came from. Superintendent Chalmers, Principal Skinner's perpetually disappointed overseer, is a character that school employees across America have reportedly identified as a recognizable type, not a caricature of an educational administrator in general, but a precise rendering of a specific kind of institutional middleman, someone trapped between the pressures from above and the chaos from below, whose characteristic emotion is not anger but the particular exhaustion of someone who once had higher expectations. Former teachers who have watched the show have described moments of recognition, not flattering recognition, but the slightly uncomfortable kind where you see yourself in a character not because you are that character at your best, but because you are that character at your most tired, your most bureaucratically defeated, your most resigned. This is one of the things The Simpsons did extraordinarily well in its best seasons. It rendered the particular quality of institutional disappointment with enough precision that people who worked inside institutions recognized themselves in it. Not as a primary identification, not as their fullest self, but as the version of themselves that particular systems, particular pressures, particular configurations of responsibility without authority were capable of producing. Sideshow Bob Kelsey Grammer's cultured, theatrical, endlessly scheming villain is a character whose origins are more transparent than most. He is a highly specific parody of a certain kind of British theatrical grandeur, of the classical actor whose relationship to American popular culture is one of contemptuous condescension that conceals a secret fascination. Grammer's own background in Frasier, his public persona as a voice actor of particular distinction, informed the character in ways that made it feel slightly confessional rather than purely satirical. But Sideshow Bob also embodies something more specific than theatrical snobbery. He is a man whose genuine brilliance coexists with a profound incapacity for accepting that the world is not what he needs it to be. His various schemes are not motivated primarily by the desire to hurt anyone, though they involve harm. They are motivated by the need to impose order, his aesthetic, his vision of how things should be on a world that stubbornly refuses to conform to it. Writers who have worked in the entertainment industry, in television production specifically, have described recognizing in Sideshow Bob certain qualities of a certain kind of creative, professional, someone with real talent and real aesthetic judgment who cannot navigate the gap between their vision and the commercial reality of the medium they work in. Someone whose frustration has curdled into something more destructive. Someone who keeps executing complex, brilliant plans that fail because they are, at their root, about the wrong things. This reading of Sideshow Bob is obviously not the only reading. He is also just a very funny villain, and his repeated failures are funny for reasons that do not require this level of analysis. But the depth of the character, the reason he has remained compelling across more than 2 decades and more appearances than almost any other recurring character outside the main cast, comes from this additional layer. From the sense that his pathology is recognizable, that you have met this person or been this person or worked beside this person in a real context, even if the real context did not involve attempted murder. The real people question becomes most interesting when applied to the show's female characters, because the show's female characters were, for much of its history, written primarily by men, and the women who appear in the show tend toward one of a limited number of types: the patient wife, the overachiever daughter, the resigned mother, the ambitious career woman. These types are real. They are recognizable, but they are also incomplete in ways that become more visible when you compare them to the show's male characters, which have a broader range and more consistent interiority. Marge Simpson is the character where this limitation is most consequential. She is, in many respects, the show's most underwritten major character, not because she is not present, but because the show's version of her is so consistent, so settled into her particular set of qualities, that she never quite becomes the full human being that her situation implies. The real women that the Simpsons writers knew, the women in their lives, the women in the entertainment industry around them, the women whose experiences they were drawing on when they wrote Marge, had internal lives that Marge rarely gets to have. They had ambitions that were more specific than Marge's generalized desire for more. They had frustrations that were more pointed than Marge's generalized patience. They had humor that was harder-edged and more private than the warmth Marge typically displays. Some of that truth got into the character. The episodes where Marge's patience breaks, where her frustration becomes visible, where she articulates something about her life that she would usually keep internal. These are among the show's most powerful pieces of character, writing precisely because they feel like the real person breaking through the archetype. But they are exceptions. The archetype is the dominant mode. The real people behind the Simpsons characters are visible in the show's best moments and invisible in its more average ones. When the writing is at its finest, you can feel the specific human observation beneath the comic exaggeration, the real person that the character is being assembled from, the genuine experience that the joke is distilling into fiction. What the show never fully resolved and what its history of character origination makes visible is the tension between using real people as source material and representing them fairly. The best characters in the show are not the ones that most closely approximate the real people they came from. They are the ones that take something true from those people and transform it into something that can be understood outside the specific context from which it was drawn. That transformation from specific observed reality to universal fictional truth is what separates great character writing from impersonation. The Simpsons, at its best, was extraordinary at that transformation. At its worst, it stopped at impersonation. And the gap between those two modes of character creation is where the show's creative history becomes most interesting to trace. Section 8. The Network Wars: Fox versus The Simpsons Writers. The relationship between The Simpsons and Fox Network is one of the most complicated creative commercial partnerships in the history of American television. It spans 36 years, multiple corporate owners, multiple network leadership regimes, multiple iterations of what Fox thought it was and what The Simpsons thought it was doing, and an ongoing negotiation about power and creative control that has never been fully described publicly and that shapes every episode of the show that has ever aired. To understand this relationship, you have to understand what Fox was when The Simpsons began, and what The Simpsons meant to Fox in those early years. In 1989, Fox was not a major network. It was a new challenger, a fourth network in a landscape that had been dominated by three for decades, a network that was finding its identity through the programming it chose to air and the audiences it was trying to reach. It had The Tracy Ullman Show, it had Married with Children, and it had, from December 1989, The Simpsons. The Simpsons was not immediately the dominant cultural phenomenon it would become. The first season was solid, the ratings were respectable, and the critical reception was positive without being ecstatic. But it grew. The second season grew. The third season produced a show that was, in the view of many critics, the best thing on American television in any format. By the time the show reached its peak in the mid-90s, it was not just Fox's most successful show. It was the thing that had legitimized Fox as a network. The thing that had proven a fourth network could compete with the three established giants for cultural relevance. This gave the show extraordinary leverage. A show that has made your network credible has earned a kind of institutional gratitude that translates, practically, into more creative freedom. Fox's executives, in the early and middle years of the show, were aware that The Simpsons was the foundation of their brand's credibility in a way that made them reluctant to push back too hard against its creative decisions. But leverage is not permanent, it is relative. As Fox grew, as it developed more successful shows, as its brand became established through a portfolio of programming rather than a single flagship, The Simpsons' leverage naturally diminished. The show was still enormously valuable, but it was no longer irreplaceable in the same way it had been in 1993. Fox could now afford to have views about the show that it could not have afforded in 1989. This shift in the power dynamic was gradual rather than sudden, and it did not produce any dramatic confrontations that became public record. What it produced was a slow accumulation of small negotiations, small modifications, small decisions made in rooms where the show's representatives and the network's representatives reached agreements that everyone publicly described as collaborative and that privately involved the usual complex choreography of competing interests trying to find workable compromises. The show's relationship to Fox's news division became increasingly complicated as the network's political positioning became more defined. Rupert Murdoch's acquisition of various media properties and the launch of Fox News in 1996 created an association between the Fox brand and a particular ideological orientation that The Simpsons creators were, to put it mildly, not comfortable with. The Simpsons had always been politically satirical in a way that resisted simple categorization. It made fun of Democrats and Republicans with something approaching equal opportunity. It satirized liberal pieties as readily as conservative ones. It was, in the tradition of the best political comedy, ideologically promiscuous, more interested in puncturing pretension and exposing hypocrisy than in advancing any specific political agenda. But as Fox News became more prominent and more explicitly associated with a specific political perspective, The Simpsons' continued presence on the Fox broadcast network created a visual association that the show's creators were aware of and that they began to address. Somewhat obliquely, within the show itself. The jokes about Fox News that appear throughout the show's post-1996 seasons are not subtle. They are pointed, consistent, and exactly the kind of thing that you would not expect a network to allow its own flagship show to say about a sibling entity. The fact that Fox allowed these jokes is interesting. The explanation that the show's own producers have generally offered is that Fox's entertainment and news divisions operated with genuine independence from each other, that the decision-makers in the entertainment division were not coordinating with the decision-makers in the news division, and that the show's jokes about Fox News were permitted because the people who would have needed to stop them were simply not paying close attention to that particular category of content. This explanation is plausible. Large corporations with multiple divisions frequently operate with less coordination than their organizational charts suggest. The Simpsons aired under the jurisdiction of Fox Entertainment, and Fox Entertainment's relationship to Fox News was not the relationship of a coordinating entity, but of a parallel operation with overlapping branding. But it is also the case that the jokes were sometimes pointed enough and specific enough that their continued presence in the show suggests at minimum a decision to allow them rather than simply a failure to notice them. The Fox News parody that appeared in the show, the fictional version of the network, with its crawl of absurdist partisan text, was not invisible. It was noticed and discussed. The decision to leave it in was a decision, even if it was framed as a non-decision, as the absence of an objection, rather than the presence of approval. The money negotiations that have shaped the show's history are less discussed than the creative ones, but are at least as consequential. The Simpsons has been renegotiated several times over its history, and each renegotiation has been a significant event in the business of television. The show's voice cast, its producers, its animation house all have participated in negotiations with Fox that were, on various occasions, described as genuinely difficult. The most dramatic of these was a negotiation in the show's later years in which Fox reportedly threatened to end the show rather than agree to the financial terms being requested. The threat was taken seriously enough that the show itself addressed the possibility of cancellation in ways that were somewhat unusual episodes that played with the idea of the show's end, that depicted Springfield's future in ways that were ambiguous about whether that future would actually be told. The negotiation resolved. The show continued. But the episode of institutional history that the negotiation represented was not forgotten by the people who had been through it. The understanding that Fox was willing to end the show rather than agree to certain terms was a piece of information that everyone involved carried forward, that shaped subsequent negotiations, that defined the actual limits of the show's institutional freedom in ways that the creative freedom the show publicly exercised obscured. The network's role in the show's evolution over time is also visible in the kinds of content the show has been more or less willing to produce in different eras. In the show's early seasons, when it was still establishing itself, and when Fox was still establishing itself, both the show and the network were more willing to take risks. Episodes that pushed harder against political targets, character choices that were more emotionally vulnerable, storylines that engaged with darker aspects of American life with less cushioning of humor. As both the show and the network became institutions, as they became the things they were defending rather than the things they were building, the risk-taking became more calculated. The show still produced genuinely brave work, but bravery in an institution is different from bravery in a newcomer. Bravery in an institution requires more scaffolding, more justification, more negotiation of terms. It requires more people to agree before it can happen. The writer's room of the show's later seasons was producing work inside a much more complex institutional environment than the writer's room of the first few seasons. Not worse work, necessarily complexity is not the same as limitation, but work that was aware of its own constraints in ways that the early work was not. Work that had internalized the history of negotiations and modifications and held content and network relationships that defined the space it was operating in. This internalization is visible in the show's self-referential humor about the network, which became more sophisticated over time, but also more contained, more likely to take a specific, limited shot at a specific, limited target, and then retreat to safer ground than to sustain a broader challenge to the institutional relationship. The jokes about Fox remained in the show, but they operated within a genre of permitted self-criticism that had been carefully established over years of negotiation. The network wars of The Simpsons were not wars in any dramatic sense. There were no famous walkouts, no showrunners fired over creative differences with the network, no episodes suppressed in ways that became public scandals. The negotiations were conducted with the professionalism of people who needed to keep working together, who had too much at stake to let genuine conflict reach the surface. What they produced, across 36 years, was a show that was shaped as much by what it could not do as by what it chose to do. A show whose creative record includes not just the episodes that aired, but the decisions that were made about what would not be aired, what would be modified, what would be attempted, and then withdrawn before completion. The institutional history of The Simpsons is not the same as its creative history, but the two are inseparable. Every episode that aired is the product of both of the writer's ambition and the network's calculations, of the show's desire to say something and the institution's desire to protect something. The tension between those two things is not always visible, but it is always present. And the show that resulted from it is more honest, more complicated, and more interesting than a show produced by either force alone could have been. Section 9. The sideshow, Bob problem, a character the show couldn't let go. There is a point in the history of any recurring antagonist when the narrative has clearly said everything it needs to say about them, when the character has been fully developed and fully expressed, and has accomplished everything that the story requires of them, and the only honest creative choice is to let them go. The Simpsons has faced this point with Sideshow Bob multiple times across more than 3 decades, and every single time it has arrived at it, the show has flinched. The result is one of the most interesting creative problems in the show's history, not a problem of quality, because the Sideshow Bob episodes are almost uniformly excellent, but a problem of honesty. A problem of a show that knows what it should do, and consistently, deliberately, entertainingly chooses not to do it. Sideshow Bob Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., to use his full name, which the show deploys with a particular kind of theatrical relish, first appeared in Season 1 as Krusty the Clown's sidekick. He was, at this point, a background figure, a secondary character in a storyline about Krusty, with no particular depth or distinction. He was the tall one who handed things to the funny one. He was furniture with better hair. The episode that changed him, that created the Sideshow Bob who has persisted through dozens of appearances and more than 30 years, was the 4th episode of the first season, Krusty Gets Busted. In this episode, Sideshow Bob frames Krusty for a convenience store robbery, gets him arrested, and takes over his television show, turning it from low-quality children's entertainment into something that, in Bob's vision, would be genuinely culturally enriching. He makes the children watch masterpiece theater. He discusses opera. He attempts, through the specific medium of a children's comedy show, to impose his aesthetic on a world that does not want it. He is caught, of course. Bart unravels the frame-up, Krusty is released, Bob is arrested. The episode is resolved in the way that children's mystery stories are resolved, with the child protagonist's intelligence defeating the adult antagonist's scheme. But something remained after the resolution. Something in the way Bob's defeat was handled, in the particular quality of his downfall, in the sense that his scheme had been not merely criminal, but also, and this is what makes him unusual, genuinely motivated by something other than simple greed or malice. Bob wanted to make the children's show better. This is funny and absurd and completely impractical, but it is not the goal of a villain. It is the goal of someone who cares desperately about quality and is deeply frustrated by a world that has given cultural gatekeeping responsibilities to people who do not understand what those responsibilities require. The writers recognized immediately that they had created something unusual, a villain whose villainy was inseparable from genuine aesthetic conviction, a criminal whose crimes were, at their root, about the wrong things rather than about the wrong things done for wrong reasons. Bob was not evil, he was wrong. And being wrong in that particular way, being convinced of your own rightness to a degree that justifies any method, is far more interesting, dramatically and comedically, than simple evil. So the show brought him back, and then brought him back again, and then again. The structure of almost every Sideshow Bob episode is the same. Bob has been released from prison. Bob has developed a new and elaborate scheme to do something to Bart specifically, or to Springfield more generally. The scheme is brilliant in conception and ultimately unsuccessful in execution. Bob is returned to prison. The episode ends. What varies is the quality of the scheme, the specificity of Bob's stated grievances, the degree to which the episode allows Bob to make a case for himself that the audience finds sympathetically compelling, even while recognizing that he is, on balance, still wrong. The best Sideshow Bob episodes are the ones where Bob's arguments are hardest to dismiss, where his contempt for popular culture, his frustration with a world that rewards mediocrity and punishes excellence, his sense that he has been specifically and personally victimized by the triumph of stupidity over intelligence, sounds less like villainy and more like a reasonable, if poorly managed, response to a recognizable problem. The show has been aware of this quality in the character from early on. The writers know that Bob is sympathetic. They know that his grievances, extracted from the criminal methods he employs to address them, resonate. And they have used this knowledge skillfully, deploying episodes that ask the audience to sit with the discomfort of finding a murderous villain more articulate and more culturally insightful than the show's protagonists. But the structure remains the same. Bob schemes, Bob fails, Bob returns to prison. The cycle is explicit. The show has made jokes about the cycle, has had characters comment on the cycle, has done an episode that was essentially about the cycle itself, about why it keeps repeating, about what it says about both Bob and Springfield, that the same man keeps escaping and scheming and failing, and returning in an endless loop that benefits no one. The honest end of the Sideshow Bob arc was available to the show very early. It was available the first time Bob was arrested. It was available the second time. At some point, at the point where Bob had been returned to prison more times than could be explained by the Springfield justice system's performance record, the show had accumulated enough comic capital in the repetition to finally spend it on something true, on an episode that recognized the cycle and broke it, on a storyline that took Bob's genuine qualities seriously enough to imagine what would happen if he applied them to something constructive rather than destructive. On a conclusion, the show did not take this path. Instead, it turned the repetition itself into the joke, which is a clever solution but not an honest one. Acknowledging that you are avoiding resolution is not the same as achieving resolution. Self-awareness about a creative failure is not the same as fixing the creative failure. It is a way of making the failure part of the entertainment, which is funny and which also means the failure continues. The Bob episode that came closest to genuine resolution was not one of the comedic ones. It was an episode from the show's later seasons that allowed Bob an experience of something that looked like what his life might have been if his choices had been different. An episode that gave him genuine warmth, genuine connection, genuine moments of the kind of life he had been claiming, all along, to be the one who deserved, and then took those things away again. Because the show does not know how to give Sideshow Bob what he deserves. Not because what he deserves is unclear, but because what he deserves is an ending, and endings are what Springfield does not do. The Sideshow Bob problem is the Simpsons problem in concentrated form. A show that is brilliant at beginnings and middles, and that has an institutional allergy to endings. A show that can develop a character with extraordinary precision and emotional depth, and then cannot find a way to honor that development with a conclusion that matches it. A show that prefers the maintenance of its best elements to the risk of completing them. This preference is, on some level, understandable. Completing a storyline means losing it. Ending Sideshow Bob means no more Sideshow Bob episodes, and the Sideshow Bob episodes are reliably among the show's best. The calculation is practical, and the people making it are not wrong in the short term. But in the long term, the avoidance of resolution produces exactly the kind of creative exhaustion that critics of the show's later seasons describe. When a show has been making the same choice, same structure, same outcome, same deferred conclusion for 30 years, the audience eventually stops expecting anything different. They stop hoping for the ending. They accept the loop. And accepting the loop is a way of disengaging from the narrative, of watching for comfort rather than anticipation, of enjoying the familiar without expecting to be surprised. Sideshow Bob deserved better than the loop. The show knew it. The audience knew it. And the show chose the loop anyway. Every time, with such consistency that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a condition. Something that could not be otherwise. Something that was, perhaps, part of the show's essential nature rather than a decision that could have been made differently. Maybe that is the most honest reading of the Sideshow Bob problem. Not that the show was wrong to keep bringing him back, but that the bringing back was always itself the story, not the particular schemes or the particular failures, but the cycle itself. The endless return, the Sisyphean quality of a brilliant man who keeps trying and keeps failing in the same way for reasons that are always the same reason. His inability to accept the world as it is, his need to remake it in his image, his catastrophic overconfidence in his own methods. This is Springfield's story. It is every character's story in this town. The eternal recurrence, the reset, the return to the same positions after every catastrophe. Sideshow Bob is just the character through whom this dynamic is most explicitly, most theatrically, and most beautifully expressed. He will be back, he will scheme, he will fail, he will be returned to prison. And the show will never have to answer the question of what happens when the loop finally stops. Because in Springfield, loops do not stop. That is the one thing this town does reliably. Section 10. The quiet tragedy of secondary Springfield. Springfield is enormous. Not in the way that real cities are enormous geographically. Springfield is famously impossible to pin down. Simultaneously coastal and landlocked, simultaneously northern and southern, containing a geography that is internally inconsistent and externally unverifiable. But in terms of population, in terms of the density of human experience that the show has accumulated across 36 seasons, Springfield is vast. It contains hundreds of named characters, thousands of unnamed ones. It has a school system, a hospital system, a court system, a police force, a criminal underworld, a religious establishment, several competing cultural institutions, and a self-organizing social life that operates according to rules that are both familiar and strange. And in the middle of all of this, behind the Simpsons and the Burns and the Flanders and the Smithers and the small cast of characters who are recognizable to any viewer, there is secondary Springfield. The Springfield of the people who matter to the show without being central to it, who have names and histories and storylines that the show introduced and then did not fully develop, who became important to some viewers and then were gently, sometimes abruptly, set aside when the show's attention moved elsewhere. The tragedy of secondary Springfield is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the specific sadness of watching characters develop enough to make you care about them, and then watching the show lose interest in them before they reach any conclusion that feels right. Principal Skinner is one of the most developed secondary characters in the show's history, which makes his particular trajectory one of the most instructive. In the early seasons, Skinner was a figure of genuine pathos, a man whose Vietnam War experience had left him damaged in ways the show acknowledged without fully exploring, whose relationship with his mother Agnes was portrayed as psychologically complex in a way that actual television rarely managed, whose position in the school hierarchy placed him in a perpetual state of tension between the authority he nominally held and the complete absence of institutional support for that authority. The best Skinner episodes of the show's early and middle periods are deeply sympathetic without being sentimental. They show a man who is doing his best in conditions that make his best genuinely insufficient, who has genuine qualities and genuine limitations that have been shaped by experience in ways the show takes seriously, who deserves more than the position he occupies but cannot find his way to anything better. Then came the Armin Tamzarian revelation, which has been discussed in these pages already in its theoretical implications, but deserves revisiting for what it did specifically to Skinner as a character. The revelation that Skinner was not who he said he was did not just undermine his backstory. It undermined the sympathy that his backstory had earned. All the complexity, all the pathos, all the carefully developed understanding of this specific man with this specific history that history was retroactively revealed as borrowed. The man who had experienced Vietnam was someone else. The man who had developed a complicated relationship with his mother Agnes had done so from the starting point of deception. The writers' room's decision to reveal this, and to resolve it in the way they did by having the town vote to maintain the fiction, was a creative choice that served a satirical purpose. But it came at the cost of a character who had been, up to that point, one of the show's most sustained achievements in secondary character development. After the Tamzarian episode, something in the show's treatment of Skinner changed. The character remained present, remained important to storylines involving the school, but never quite recovered the specific depth it had achieved before the revelation. This is the particular grief of secondary Springfield. Characters developed with care and precision to a certain point, and then either disrupted by a creative decision that undercut their development or simply allowed to stagnate, kept present but not moving forward, occupying their positions in the show's world without growing in them. Barney Gumble is perhaps the most quietly devastating example of this dynamic. Barney was, in the early seasons, one of the show's most consistent sources of genuine sadness beneath the comedy. He was brilliant, the show established this specifically, giving him an intelligence that his alcoholism had obscured and degraded but not destroyed. He had been Homer's closest friend since childhood. He had potential that his circumstances had crushed so thoroughly that he no longer seemed aware of it. The show gave him a storyline, in the middle seasons, about sobriety, about what happened when Barney stopped drinking. The answer was complicated and real and, for a show of this kind, remarkably honest. Barney sober was not Barney transformed into a better version of himself. He was Barney in the uncomfortable middle space of being no longer what he had been and not yet what he might become. A man rediscovering himself with no support structure for what he found. A man for whom the community that had accepted his alcoholism had no particular role for his sobriety. The sobriety storyline was not maintained. The show found reasons to return Barney to drinking, because Barney as comic relief was more practically useful than Barney as genuine recovery narrative. The return to drinking was handled with enough self-awareness that it did not feel entirely like a betrayal. But it was a retreat from a difficult truth back toward a comfortable function. What Barney might have become if the show had followed the sobriety storyline to a real conclusion is one of Springfield's most interesting unanswered questions. Not because sobriety is necessarily more narratively interesting than alcoholism, but because the version of Barney that was beginning to emerge uncertain, searching, genuinely vulnerable in ways that his drunk self had armored against, was a character the show had not yet shown itself capable of writing, and the question of whether it could have managed it is genuinely compelling. Mo Sislak is another secondary character whose depth the show has consistently acknowledged and consistently failed to fully honor. He is, in the show's established mythology, a man of genuine sadness, someone whose loneliness is not a comedy condition but an actual emotional reality, whose depression is real enough to have driven multiple suicidal gestures played for comedy in the show, which is one of the ways the show handles difficult material by making it ambient rather than confrontational, whose need for human connection is never fully met by the context of his own bar and the people who drink in it. The show has produced several genuinely beautiful episodes about Mo, episodes that earned his sadness and found language for it, and allowed the character to be fully human rather than simply functional. These are among the show's most underrated achievements in character writing. Mo's most honest moments when the comedy drops away and what is left is simply a lonely man confronting his loneliness, directly have a specific quality that is unusual for the show. They feel like they were written for him, not for what he does for other characters. But these moments have never accumulated into a sustained narrative. They appear and then recede, like the sobriety storyline, like Skinner's complexity, like every serious development in secondary Springfield that gets introduced and then deprioritized when the comedy's demands reassert themselves. This is the structural trap that secondary characters fall into in long-running comedy. They develop enough to become beloved. They develop enough for the show's writers to understand what honest development for them would look like. And then the demands of their function as supporting characters, as comedy elements, as pieces of an ensemble that must be kept in their proper relationships to the main cast prevent the development from going where it should go. Springfield's secondary characters are, in this sense, a mirror of their own town's situation. They are trapped, not by radiation or by a coma or by a billionaire's schemes, but by the structural requirements of the medium that contains them. By the fact that the show needs them to be funny before it needs them to be real, and that funny and real are not always incompatible but are always in tension, and that when the tension resolves, it resolves toward funny. There is one secondary Springfield character whose particular tragedy deserves to be named specifically because it is the most visible and the most unresolved and the one that the audience has most consistently noted and mourned. That character is Lionel Hutz. Hutz was voiced by Phil Hartman, who appeared in the show from its early seasons as the incompetent ambulance-chasing lawyer, a character played for pure comedy with great affection and great specific skill. Hartman's voice work was exceptional. He brought a specific, recognizable quality to Hutz that made him feel fully inhabited rather than simply performed. Phil Hartman was murdered in 1998. His death was sudden and violent and completely unconnected to the show, and the show's response to it was immediate and permanent. The characters that Hartman had voiced were retired. Hutz would never appear again. Troy McClure, the other major Hartman character, would never appear again. The show chose not to recast them, not to continue them with a different voice, not to find a way to keep the characters present. This was, by any reasonable measure, the right choice. The characters were inseparable from Hartman's particular voice. Recasting them would not have honored his memory. Keeping them would have required either recasting or the more unsettling option of archiving old recordings to create new performances, which neither the show nor Hartman's family wanted. But the absence of Hutz and McClure from Springfield's subsequent 25-plus years of episodes is a tangible one. You can feel the gap they left. Not in any specific plotline the show adapted, found other characters to fill similar narrative functions, moved on in the practical sense. But in the texture of the show, in its secondary population, something is different. Something is missing that does not get replaced by what comes after. This is, in miniature, the particular grief of secondary Springfield. Characters that become essential to the specific quality of the world they inhabit, and then are gone, for whatever reason, and the world they inhabited continues without them, carrying the shape of their absence. Springfield is full of absences, of characters who were present and then weren't, of storylines that were started and then stopped, of depths that were indicated and then left unexplored. The town is rich with history and richer with the history of everything that almost was but wasn't. That accumulation of near misses, of half-told stories, of characters who got 3/4 of what they deserved and then were redirected by something practical and external that is the quiet tragedy that runs beneath the comedy. The thing that makes Springfield feel real in the end, because reality is also full of this, full of people who became less than they might have been, full of stories that did not reach their natural conclusion, full of things that were genuinely important that the world moved past without acknowledging them. Section 11. The music of Springfield scandals, lawsuits, and hidden genius. The Simpsons is, among its many other things, one of the most musically sophisticated comedies in the history of American television. Its theme music is one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever written for television. Its episodes have featured original songs that are, by the standards of the medium they were produced in, genuinely extraordinary. And beneath all of this, running through 36 years of episodes like a current that most viewers never fully notice, is a musical intelligence that shapes the show's emotional register in ways that go far beyond background scoring. The theme music was composed by Danny Elfman. This is well known. What is less discussed is the specific creative context in which Elfman composed it, and what that context reveals about both the music itself and the show's ambitions in its earliest days. Elfman received the assignment from Matt Groening in 1989 with a brief that was, by most accounts, genuinely minimal. He was given an indication of the show's tone and setting and not much else. What he produced in response was a piece of music that captured something specific and slightly paradoxical about the show, something that was simultaneously warm and slightly eerie, familiar and strange. The sound of American suburban life filtered through a perspective that was affectionate about it and also slightly not quite convinced by it. The theme exists in two versions. The one that has been used throughout the show's run is slightly different from Elfman's original recording, altered in ways that are technically minimal but tonally significant. The original recording has a slightly more prominent bass line, a slightly darker quality in certain passages, a quality that is more openly ambivalent about the material it is scoring. The broadcast version is warmer, more immediately inviting, more transparently the music of a family comedy. Both versions are extraordinary. But the fact that the show moved from the darker original to the warmer broadcast version in its very first step from composition to broadcast is itself a record of something of the ongoing negotiation between what the show was in, its most honest form, and what it needed to be to succeed in the context that would receive it. Alf Clausen composed the score for the show from its second season through 2017. A run of more than 25 years that produced thousands of individual cues and dozens of original songs that have become permanently embedded in the cultural memory of the show's audience. His departure from the show, not voluntary, announced by the production in a way that apparently came without warning to Clausen himself, was one of the more troubling behind-the-scenes events in the show's recent history. Clausen's score for the show was not simple. It was, in the tradition of the best television scoring, built on a relationship between music and image that was more sophisticated than the comedy it served required. He used classical structures, variations on themes, counterpoint, orchestral development in service of gags that most viewers experienced as pure comedy, without necessarily registering the musical architecture beneath them. His work was simultaneously functional and genuinely interesting as music, a combination that is far rarer in television scoring than the volume of television produced makes it seem. His departure was attributed publicly to a desire for a different musical direction for the show. The replacement scoring, handled through digital means that allowed for more flexibility in production, was different in ways that some viewers noticed immediately and some did not notice at all. Less orchestrally ambitious, more direct in its relationship to the scenes it was scoring, less likely to do something musically surprising when the comedy was doing something straightforward. The specific quality of Clausen's contribution to the show is visible most clearly in the episodes that relied most heavily on music, the musical episodes, the episodes that contained original songs and required the scoring to support those songs while also carrying the episode's dramatic weight. These are the episodes where the show's musical sophistication is most visible, most directly engaging with the audience, most dependent on the quality of the composition and arrangement to succeed. The songs themselves are worth examining in detail, because the best of them represent something unusual in the landscape of American TV comedy music. They are not parodies of song forms. They are songs that function in the forms they inhabit, that use the structure and emotional logic of the musical genres they are working in to do something that is both genuinely funny and genuinely affecting. Moaning Lisa's blues-influenced piece is a prime example. It is funny, yes, in the way that a sad 8-year-old playing serious jazz is inherently funny. But the music is actually good. The emotional content of the melody, the harmonic choices, the improvisatory quality of the performance, these are not approximations of blues feeling designed for comedy purposes. They are the real thing, calibrated to express something true about the character that the episode's dialogue could not fully carry. The show has produced original songs across its history that work in this way, that do something musically real rather than merely suggestive. Songs that could exist outside the show they were written for and still function as music rather than as jokes about music. This is the exception in television comedy, which tends toward parody and pastiche rather than original creation. The Simpsons, in its musical ambitions, was genuinely original, and that originality was the product of people in the production who cared about music as music rather than as a comedy tool. The lawsuits that have touched the show's musical history are less discussed than they deserve to be, not because they are numerous, they are not, compared to the legal history of the entertainment industry in general, but because the ones that occurred illuminate something specific about the show's creative process and its relationship to the musical culture it was drawing from. The most interesting involved the show's use of musical elements that bore sufficient resemblance to existing compositions to attract legal attention. The show has generally settled these matters without full public disclosure, but the pattern of them suggests something about the way the show's composers and writers approached musical reference with the same appetite for borrowing and transforming and repurposing that the show's dialogue writers brought to verbal and visual reference. The Simpsons has always been a show that engaged deeply with its cultural context by absorbing it, transforming it, and returning it in a form that was simultaneously familiar and strange. This approach works extraordinarily well in comedy writing, where the recognition element of a reference is part of the joke's mechanism. It works somewhat differently in music, where the line between inspired by and derived from is technically specific and legally defined in ways that comedy writing is not. The tension between the show's transformative creative instincts and the legal requirements of musical copyright has produced a small but revealing set of instances where the transformation was not considered sufficient to constitute independence from the source. These instances are not the show's most glorious moments, but they are honest documents of the creative process of a show that worked by absorption and transformation, that sometimes absorbed more than it transformed, and that occasionally had to navigate the legal consequences of that creative tendency. The musical episodes, the episodes that were explicitly designed around original songs rather than using music as scoring or punctuation, represent the show's highest musical ambitions and its most sustained musical achievements. These episodes are, by most critical assessments, among the best the show has ever produced. They are certainly the episodes that have retained their power most consistently across the decades since they aired. The first major musical episode was in the show's early period. Its success established a template. Take a specific musical form or genre, apply it to the show's characters and situations with genuine musical craft rather than simple imitation, and allow the music to carry emotional weight that the comedy cannot bear alone. The episode works not despite the music being real, but because of it. The jokes in a musical episode land because the music they are embedded in has enough integrity to be taken seriously, and the combination of serious musical craft and comic content creates a tonal range that neither element could achieve alone. This is the fundamental insight of the show's musical best work. Comedy and music are both about timing, both about the relationship between expectation and surprise, both about the precision of a specific choice in a specific moment. When they work together, they multiply each other's effects. The joke is funnier because the music meant something. The music is more affecting because it is in a joke. The combination produces something that is neither pure comedy nor pure music, but a third thing that each medium alone cannot create. The scandal of The Simpsons' musical history is not any specific incident. It is the underestimation. The consistent failure of critical discussions of the show to engage with its musical dimension as a dimension of the show's genuine artistic ambition. The tendency to treat the songs as incidental, charming, occasionally memorable, but not central to what the show is doing. This underestimation is wrong. The music is central. The specific quality of emotion that the show's best episodes produce, the thing that makes you laugh and feel something at the same time, that creates a tonal register that no other show has quite matched, is not achievable without the music. The music is not decoration. It is load-bearing. It is, in the most structural sense, part of what makes the show work. Alf Clausen understood this. Danny Elfman understood it. The show's best music directors and composers understood it. And the relative silence around the musical dimension of the show's achievement is one of the quieter scandals of its critical history, the thing that most discussions leave out because it is harder to analyze in words than dialogue or plot or character, and because the language for discussing television music as a serious artistic achievement has never been fully developed. The music of Springfield deserves a full accounting. Not just the memorable songs, not just the theme, but the thousands of small musical decisions that shaped the emotional texture of 36 years of episodes, that told you when to laugh harder and when to feel something, that positioned the comedy in a key that made it more than the sum of its jokes. That accounting has not been written yet, and until it is, the full picture of what The Simpsons actually achieved what it was, in all its dimensions, not just the ones that are easiest to discuss, remains incomplete. Closing. The long dream of Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have walked its streets and sat in its diners and listened to the conversations happening in its writers' rooms and on its network floors and in the quiet spaces between the jokes where the show was making decisions about what to say and what to leave unsaid. What emerges from all of it, from the background characters and the creative conflicts and the celebrity complications and the band episodes and the troubled histories and the hidden messages and the real people and the institutional wars and the characters the show could not let go and the secondary lives it left unfinished, and the music, nobody gave enough credit to what emerges, is a picture of a thing that is bigger and stranger and more humanly complicated than any single description of it has ever fully captured. The Simpsons is the longest-running animated show in American history. This is a fact about its duration, but duration is not the same as achievement, and the show's achievement is not simply that it lasted. Plenty of things last without deserving to. The achievement is that it did something in its best seasons that very few things have done in the history of comedy. It made you laugh at the most recognizable aspects of the most recognizable kind of American life, and it made you feel something real about those same things, and it did both simultaneously in a way that neither diminished the comedy nor softened the feeling. It held two apparently incompatible modes of engagement, laughter and genuine emotion in productive tension for long enough and consistently enough that the combination became the show's defining quality, the thing you could not find elsewhere, the specific reason you kept coming back. That achievement was the product of hundreds of people across dozens of years making thousands of decisions in contexts that were sometimes inspired and sometimes institutional, and sometimes both, and sometimes neither. It was built from the conflicts described in these pages, and from the ones that were never described anywhere. From the things the show managed to say and the things it wanted to say but could not reach. From the characters it developed fully and the ones it left in the middle. From the music it made honestly and the music it borrowed and the music it lost when the people who made it were gone. Springfield is not a real place, but it has the weight of real places. The weight of accumulated history and incomplete stories, and the specific human texture of a world that has been imagined in enough detail to feel as though it developed rather than was constructed. The scandals nobody talks about are not really scandals in the usual sense. They are not explosions. They are not catastrophes. They are the slower, quieter, more persistent things, the creative compromises and institutional negotiations and representation failures and character developments deferred and musical achievements unacknowledged and human complications of making art in a commercial context for a very long time. They are the things that happen when a show endures. Not despite the show's quality, but alongside it, sometimes because of it, because the show was successful enough to develop complications, important enough to draw scrutiny, long-running enough to accumulate a history complex enough to be worth examining carefully. The Simpsons has always been a show about a family in a town. At its deepest level, it has been a show about what it means to stay, to be in the same place, with the same people, across the changes that time brings, trying to be decent and mostly failing and getting back up. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, on the same couch, in the same house, in the same impossible town, week after week, year after year, for 36 years. The scandals nobody talks about are the evidence that the people who made it stayed too. Through the conflicts and the failures and the compromises and the losses and the things that did not work and the things that did not get finished, they stayed and they kept making it. And the making of it is the record of everything they brought to it, all of it. The brilliant and the flawed, the intended and the accidental, the things they got right and the things they are still trying to figure out. That is, finally, the story of Springfield. Not the theories or the scandals or the hidden messages or the buried episodes. The story is that for 36 years, people kept showing up and doing the work and trying to make something real inside the constraints of what they had. And some of what they made was extraordinary. And all of it was honest. In the way that all human effort is honest, not always succeeding, not always right, but genuinely trying. In the room, making the choices that the moment required. Springfield will be here when you wake up, the couch gag will play, Homer will drive home, the family will sit down together, the music will begin, and for a little while, everything will be exactly as it always was. Which is, if you think about it carefully enough, exactly what we came for. The process by which background characters accrue meaning in a long-running show is not planned, it is emergent. It happens the way moss grows on a wall, not because anyone decided it should, but because the conditions were right and the time was sufficient. The show provided the conditions by returning to the same settings, the same streets, the same social spaces week after week for decades. The time was provided by the simple fact of the show's extraordinary longevity. And what grew in those conditions, over all that time, was something the production team could not have designed even if they had wanted to, which is a sense that Springfield's secondary population had lives outside the frames where they appeared. The human brain is remarkably good at constructing narratives from fragments. Show someone the same face in 3 different contexts over a period of years and they will begin, almost automatically, to construct a story about that face. Who is this person? What are they doing here? What happened between the last time we saw them and this time? The story that gets constructed is not real. It is inferred, assembled from the specific fragments the show provides, and the narrative machinery that the audience brings to those fragments from their own experience of life and story. But the story feels real because it has the texture of observation rather than invention. This is what background characters do when a show runs long enough. They stop being figures and start being people. Not because the show has made them people, but because the audience has. The show provided the raw material and then stepped back, and the audience did the rest without being asked to. The Simpsons understood this on some level, even if understanding it was not quite the same as planning for it. The show's creators and writers talked about Springfield as a real place in ways that went beyond mere world building. They talked about it as somewhere that existed independently of any particular episode, somewhere that had a continuity and a logic that the episodes merely visited rather than created. Whether this was a useful fiction maintained to keep the creative work grounded, or a genuine belief about the nature of fictional worlds, is a question that different people who worked on the show would answer differently. But the effect of it, the effect of treating Springfield as real even when the reality was clearly constructed, was that the background characters were given the benefit of that reality too. They were not ornaments. They were citizens. And citizens, over time, develop histories. There is a man who appears in several episodes of the show whom fans have taken to calling the rich Texan. He wears a 10-gallon hat. He fires his pistols in the air at moments of celebration or enthusiasm. He is a caricature of a certain strain of American wealth, specifically the oil money, big hat, loudly self-confident strain that the show associates with a specific American regional identity and uses as a target for mild satirical observation. He appears at town meetings and at Springfield events, and in the background of scenes where wealthy Springfield residents are gathered. He has a name in the show's production materials that most viewers do not know, and no backstory that has ever been substantially developed on screen. And yet, there is something about the rich Texan that repays attention, because his consistent presence in scenes of municipal power and community decision-making in Springfield is not entirely incidental. Every time Springfield is making a collective decision, every time the town gathers to vote on something, to react to a crisis, to be manipulated by a figure of authority, the rich Texan tends to be present. He is in the crowd at the town meeting where Burns's solar blocker is confronted. He is present at civic events where Springfield's power structure is visible. He is part of the background fabric of every scene where money and politics and community are visibly intertwined. Whether this is intentional, whether someone in the production made a decision to put this specific character in these specific scenes, or whether it is the organic result of a library of background characters being deployed in the settings where they most plausibly belong, is a question that does not have a clear answer. But the effect, either way, is to suggest that Springfield's moneyed class is consistently present at the moments where the town's direction is being decided. That they are never not in the room when the important things are happening. That the background of Springfield's civic life is populated, always, by people with resources and interests that the foreground story does not examine. This is the quiet political argument of Springfield's background. Not stated, not developed, not given narrative weight in any specific episode, but present, consistently, in the visual texture of the show's crowd scenes. The people with money are always in the room. The people without money are also in the room. But they are facing the wrong direction, or they are holding their signs in ways that suggest they have already decided nothing will change, or they are looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have been to this kind of meeting before and know how it ends. The background is political. It has always been political. It is just political in the way that background politics usually are, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet, consistent presence, through the accumulation of visual choices that, taken individually, mean nothing and taken together mean everything. One of the most revealing documents of the show's internal creative history is not a formal interview or a DVD commentary or a memoir. It is the pattern of who wrote which episodes in any given season, cross-referenced with which episodes from that season are most consistently regarded as the show's best work. In the seasons most widely regarded as the show's peak, roughly seasons 3 through 8, the writing credits are distributed in a way that suggests a room where competition and collaboration were productively balanced. Episodes were written by a range of writers, with enough variation that the voice of any given episode was shaped by its specific author rather than entirely subsumed into a house style. This produced something unusual in television production, a show where you could often tell by the specific texture of an episode's comedy and the specific priorities of its character work whose episode you were watching. Writers like John Swartzwelder, whose work on the show has become almost legendary among Simpsons scholars, produced episodes with such a distinctive sensibility that they are immediately recognizable as his. Swartzwelder worked in a style that was denser than most of the show's other writers, more jokes per scene, more conceptual detours, more willingness to let the logic of a gag dictate the story rather than the reverse. His episodes feel, at their best, like the show was trying to hold more ideas at once than it could quite contain, which produces a slightly pressurized quality that is exhilarating when it works and slightly dizzying when it does not. Other writers worked in very different registers. Episodes by writers who came from a more emotionally grounded tradition, writers who thought about character first and joke second, have a different texture, one that is warmer and slower and more willing to let a scene breathe rather than filling every available moment with comedy. The episodes in this mode are the ones that tend to produce the moments audiences describe as genuinely affecting the moments where the comedy stops, briefly, and something true about the characters and their circumstances is stated directly. The tension between these approaches, between the comedy-first and the character-first modes, was never resolved in the show's history. It was managed. The best seasons managed it by having both kinds of writers in the room simultaneously, where each provided a counterweight to the excesses of the other. The densely jokey episodes needed emotional grounding that the character writers could provide. The emotionally focused episodes needed wit and pace, and the willingness to subvert sentimentality that the comedy writers could supply. Together, they produced something that neither could have produced alone. The seasons where this balance was disrupted, where one mode became dominant at the expense of the other, are the seasons that fans tend to cite as the show's most uneven. Too much of the first mode and the show becomes a delivery mechanism for jokes rather than a story about people. Too much of the second and the comedy becomes secondary to emotional points that the show has not fully earned. The sweet spot is narrow, and maintaining it for any length of time requires the kind of productive, creative friction that is not comfortable to be in, but that produces the best work. This is the paradox at the heart of the writer's room conflict. The thing that made the show extraordinary, the tension between competing creative philosophies held in productive balance, was also the thing that made the work environment difficult. You cannot have the former without something like the latter. The discomfort was the mechanism, the friction was the fuel. Former writers who have spoken about the experience of working in the show's best seasons describe something that sounds genuinely demanding: a room where standards were extremely high, where mediocrity was not accepted, where the first draft of anything was understood to be merely the beginning of a process that would push the material until it reached something better than anyone had initially imagined. This is not a comfortable environment. It produces anxiety and frustration, and moments where the pressure of being held to an extremely high standard feels more like punishment than opportunity. But it also produces work that neither individual effort nor comfortable collaboration could achieve. The Simpsons' golden era writing exists at the pressure point where human creative capacity is pushed beyond what it would voluntarily do. The writers who survived that pressure and went on to long careers in television, and there are many of them, scattered across the industry, producing some of the best work in American comedy and drama, describe it as the most formative experience of their professional lives. Not the most comfortable, not the most pleasant, but the one that taught them what the work could actually be, if you were willing to keep pushing past the point where it was already good enough. There is a category of guest appearance that the histories of this show almost never discuss, which is the appearance that was turned down, the celebrities who were approached and declined, the ones who read the script and decided that what was being offered was not something they wanted to do, the ones whose publicists called and said thank you but no, without offering a specific reason, and the ones who offered reasons that were specific and interesting. The guest list of The Simpsons is, by any reckoning, extraordinary, but the list of who is not on it is also interesting. Certain kinds of fame were consistently absent from Springfield's version of celebrity. Certain types of public figure who might have been expected to appear, given the show's cultural prominence and its consistent ability to attract virtually everyone else, never did. Some of this is explicable through scheduling, through availability, through the simple logistics of coordinating a guest appearance. Some of it is explicable through the nature of the guest appearance itself, which required a specific kind of willingness to be used by the show in ways that some celebrities found unappealing. The show's approach to celebrity guests was fundamentally satirical. It used their public personas as material. It pushed those personas into comic extremes that were recognizable as exaggerations, but that were also, implicitly, observations about the distance between the public persona and the private person. This was, for many celebrities, deeply appealing, an opportunity to demonstrate self-awareness, to participate in comedy that acknowledged the constructed nature of their public image, to show an audience that they knew the game they were playing. But for other celebrities, this same quality was exactly what made the show unattractive. Participating in satire of your own public persona requires a degree of detachment from that persona that not everyone has or wants. Some people are their public image in ways that make the satirical distance uncomfortable. Some people are aware of the gap between their public image and their private self and prefer to maintain the gap rather than invite comedy to explore it. The celebrities who turned down The Simpsons, or who were never asked because someone in the production knew they would decline, represent a particular category of public figure, the kind whose relationship to their own image is too invested to permit even affectionate satirical examination. This is not necessarily a criticism of them. It is simply an observation about the difference between the kinds of celebrity that the show could accommodate and the kinds it could not. What the show could accommodate was a particular kind of security. The security of knowing that your public image is not the whole of you, that its satirical exaggeration does not reduce you, that what the show does to your persona is a form of attention rather than a threat. The celebrities who appeared on The Simpsons in its best years were almost universally people who had this security. They could laugh at themselves because they knew themselves well enough to find the laughter a relief rather than an exposure. What the show could not accommodate was fragility. Not personal fragility necessarily, but the fragility of a public image that has been built to be unquestionable, that depends on the audience's belief in its completeness, that cannot survive being pushed into comic territory, because comic territory requires acknowledgement that the image is a construction rather than a fact. This is why certain kinds of very serious famous people never appeared on The Simpsons, even when their appearance would have been culturally significant. The show would have treated them as it treated everyone as interesting constructions to be examined and gently exploded, and the examination would have been incompatible with the particular quality of authority that certain kinds of public figure depend on. Springfield welcomed the secure and the flexible and the self-aware. The brittle and the defended stayed away. And the guest list, read in this light, is a document of a particular quality that the show recognized and rewarded: the willingness to be seen, examined, and found both impressive and ridiculous by a show that regarded both of those things as forms of respect. There is a specific kind of episode that the show has produced across its history that represents, perhaps, the most honest form of content avoidance, not the episode that was pulled or modified, but the episode that was created as a deliberate misdirection. The episode that addressed a difficult subject by placing it in such an extreme context that the extremity diffused it, that made the subject so large and so cartoonish that the actual human stakes of the real version became impossible to extract from the fiction. The Simpsons has done this with subjects ranging from environmental contamination, the Blinky episode, the Dome episode, the nuclear power plant episodes collectively, to social violence, to family dysfunction. In each case, the subject is present. It is not avoided in the sense of being excluded from the show, but it is handled in a way that maintains the audience at a comic distance from the genuine stakes of the issue. Whether this is cowardice or craft is a question the show's critics and defenders have been arguing about since the beginning. The defenders' position is that satire requires distance, that the exaggeration that diffuses is also the exaggeration that illuminates, that you can see a thing more clearly when it is rendered as fiction than when it is presented as urgent reality. The critic's position is that satire that diffuses is satire that protects, that making something funny is one of the most effective ways to prevent it from being taken seriously, that The Simpsons' greatest service to the status quo is making the status quo funny rather than making it visible. Both of these positions are true, in different episodes, in different moments. The show has produced satire that genuinely illuminated and satire that genuinely deflected, and the difference between them is not always obvious from the outside. What is clear is that the episodes that were buried or modified or almost never aired represent only one part of the story of the show's difficult content. The episodes that aired as intended, but that handled their difficult subjects in ways that maintained careful comic distance, are the other part. These episodes are not scandals. They are choices. Choices about what the comedy could bear and what it could not, about where the line between illuminating satire and diffusing comedy lay, about which difficult things were worth pushing into genuinely uncomfortable territory and which were better served by the exaggerating distance of the show's visual and comic language. The production has made these choices thousands of times across 800 episodes. Some of them were right. Some of them were safe in ways that produced lesser work. And the record of all of them, both the brave and the cautious, is what the show actually is: not the idealized version that critical celebration sometimes produces, but the actual product of people trying to do something difficult under conditions that were always, to some degree, imperfect. What the Apu conversation also revealed, though this received less attention than the representation question itself, was the degree to which the show's writers' room had, for most of its history, operated without the kind of diverse representation that would have made the problem visible from the inside before it became visible from the outside. This is not a simple point. The writers' room's demographics have varied over the years, and the show has had writers from a range of backgrounds and experiences across its history. But the specific question of whether the writers' room contained people who could have said, from personal experience, this characterization causes harm, this is a different question. And the answer to it, for most of the show's history, appears to have been no. There is something important in this, not as a criticism of any individual writer's intentions or capabilities, but as an observation about the structural limitations of a creative process that lacks sufficient diversity of lived experience. The Simpsons writers were, genuinely and consistently, very smart people with genuine empathy and genuine curiosity about the world. They worked hard to understand experiences outside their own. They succeeded often enough that the show's portrait of working-class American life, and American family life, and American institutional life remains one of the most perceptive in the medium's history. But empathy is not the same as experience. Understanding from the outside is not the same as understanding from the inside. And the particular harm that the Apu character caused, the harm of having your community reduced to a caricature, and that caricature becoming the dominant representation of your community in the most watched comedy on American television, is not the kind of harm that you can fully understand until you have experienced something like it. It is experiential knowledge, not intellectual knowledge, and no amount of good intentions or diligent research produces it if you have not lived it. The show's response to the Apu situation, in retrospect, was most inadequate in its failure to bring that experiential knowledge into the conversation about what to do. It consulted its existing writers. It issued statements. It made creative adjustments. But the most meaningful contribution to resolving the situation, bringing in voices with direct experience of the harm, was not the first instinct, and was not fully pursued in the initial period of engagement. This is the deeper institutional lesson of the Apu situation, and it is one that extends well beyond any single character or any single show. The question of how entertainment institutions handle representation failures is inseparable from the question of whether those institutions have the internal diversity to recognize and address those failures before they become public controversies. And the answer, for most of the history of American television, including the history of The Simpsons, has been inadequate, not from malice but from the structural tendency of institutions to replicate themselves, to hire people who are like the people already there, to maintain the conditions under which the problem that eventually became visible was never going to be visible from the inside. The couch gag has also, across its history, served as a kind of compressed emotional summary of the episode that follows it. Not always many couch gags are purely comedic, disconnected from the episode's content in any meaningful way. But in the better seasons of the show, there is often a relationship between the tone of the couch gag and the tone of what comes after it. A dark or melancholy couch gag tends to precede an episode with darker emotional material. A particularly joyful or kinetic one tends to precede something lighter. This is not always true, and it is almost certainly not always intentional, but it is consistent enough to be interesting, to suggest that the couch gag, whatever else it does, functions as a kind of emotional preparation, a way of calibrating the audience's register before the episode proper begins. A brief musical note struck before the composition, establishing the key. This is a sophisticated use of what appears to be a simple format, and it reflects something about the show's overall compositional intelligence, its understanding that the experience of watching an episode begins before the episode proper starts, that the credit sequence and the couch gag are not preamble, but part of the structure, contributing to the audience's state of mind in ways that the episode proper depends on. The audience that arrives at an episode's first scene already slightly unsettled by a couch gag that was more disturbing than usual is a different audience from one that arrives having just laughed at a simple sight gag. The emotional setup creates a different receptivity to what follows. The show has exploited this, consciously or not, throughout its history. Consider the couch gag that depicts the family arriving to find no couch, just a bare floor, and then looking at each other with an expression that sits between bewilderment and resignation before the episode begins. This couch gag is quick. It is not funny in any obvious way, but it primes the audience with a quality of low-level strangeness, of things being slightly off in ways that cannot be articulated, that serves episodes whose emotional register is exactly that quality. The couch gag says something about disorientation before the episode says anything about anything, and the audience arrives at the story already primed for the particular flavor of discomfort the episode is going to offer. Whether this is intentional design or fortunate accident is a question the couch gag's history does not cleanly answer. The show has produced so many couch gags that statistical chance alone would produce some meaningful correlations between their tone and their episode's emotional register. But the best examples feel too precise for chance. They feel like someone in the production thought about the relationship between the gag and the episode and made a choice. One character whose real-world origins have been discussed more openly than most is Krusty the Clown. The show's creators have confirmed that Krusty is, at least in his initial conception, a version of what Homer might have been if Homer had succeeded in show business rather than ending up in the nuclear plant. The idea being that Krusty and Homer are two sides of the same character, a specific kind of American man whose lives diverged at some point and who ended up in very different positions for reasons that the show has never quite spelled out. This origin gives Krusty a specific kind of depth that his comedy persona does not always convey. He is a man who achieved the external markers of success, fame, wealth, recognition, and found them hollow in exactly the way that Homer's lack of those markers is also, in its own way, hollow. The comparison between them is implicit throughout the show's treatment of Krusty, surfacing most explicitly in episodes that allow Krusty to reflect on his life with enough honesty to see what he has and what he does not have. Krusty is a bad father. This is stated explicitly and explored honestly in multiple episodes, and it is one of the show's more sustained examinations of a character's genuine failing rather than simply a quality used for comedy. His relationship with his daughter Sophie and, in earlier seasons, with the absence of meaningful connection to anyone in his personal life, is handled with a care that his comedic function as the bad children's entertainer does not require. The show chose to give Krusty this dimension, chose to make him a person rather than just a role, and the choice was, in retrospect, essential to the show's emotional range. Because Krusty's particular failure succeeding at the public thing and failing at the private one, achieving recognition while remaining essentially alone is one of the most American of failures. The country that produced The Simpsons also produced an entire cultural apparatus devoted to the idea that professional success is the same thing as personal fulfillment, that the approval of audiences is equivalent to the love of family, that fame is a form of completeness. Krusty is the evidence that this is wrong. His fame is real and his emptiness is real, and the two coexist in a way that neither cancels out the other. The real people behind Krusty are not primarily show business people, though show business people clearly provided some of the material. They are the people who understood, from observation or experience, what happens to someone when external success and internal life are systematically divorced from each other. People who had seen this in themselves or in someone close to them. People who recognized the specific quality of Krusty's particular loneliness because they had encountered it somewhere in the real world, in a context that was less theatrical but no less genuine. The Simpsons' relationship to Fox also illuminates something broader about how creative work survives within commercial institutions. The show has sometimes been held up as a model of creative independence within the commercial television system, as evidence that a sufficiently successful and culturally important show can maintain its artistic integrity even within an institutional framework that would typically compromise it. This is partly true and partly a comforting fiction that the show itself participated in constructing. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. The Simpsons did not maintain its creative independence by being so excellent that the network stepped aside. It maintained something like creative independence by being so commercially valuable that the network calculated that interference would cost more than it gained. The leverage was financial before it was artistic. The creative freedom was permitted because the show's value to the network exceeded the value of whatever changes the network might have imposed. This is not the same thing as artistic independence in any pure sense. It is commercial independence, which is a real thing and a valuable thing, but which is available only as long as the commercial calculus remains favorable. The moment the show stopped being commercially irreplaceable, and that moment came, gradually, as the show aged and its cultural centrality diminished relative to its golden era, the calculus changed, and the quality of institutional deference the show received changed with it. The later seasons of The Simpsons have, by and large, received somewhat more active network involvement than the middle seasons. Not dramatic intervention, not the kind of wholesale interference that destroys shows, but the kind of quiet pressure that shapes things at the margins, that makes certain kinds of risk less available, that creates an environment where the ambitious choices require more justification than they did when the show was at its most commercially dominant. This is the honest version of the relationship between creative work and institutional power. Not that institutions always suppress the best work, but that institutional support for creative work is conditional on commercial value, and when that value changes, so does the support. The Simpsons was free to be what it was partly because of who it was, and partly because of what it was worth. And those two things have never been entirely separable. There is a specific episode of the show that comes closer to the honest Sideshow Bob endpoint than any other, and it is one that is rarely cited in discussions of the character because its resolution is ambiguous rather than definitive. In this episode, Bob is given access to something that looks briefly like redemption. He is allowed into the lives of a community that knows his history and chooses to engage with him anyway. He is given work that uses his genuine abilities. He is seen by people who are not afraid of him. And for the length of that episode, the cycle appears to have broken. Bob appears to have reached a place where the next chapter of his story is not prison. The episode does not fully commit to this resolution. The final act restores some version of the familiar dynamic, though not entirely. The restoration is more muted than usual, more ambivalent, less triumphant in the show's usual way of treating Bob's defeat. And the tone throughout the episode is different from the standard Sideshow Bob tone, more quiet, more genuinely interested in what Bob might be rather than what he is. This episode exists in the show's catalog as a kind of evidence that the writers could imagine a different trajectory for the character, that they had the capacity to write him differently, to honor his complexity in a way that the standard cycle did not. The fact that the episode retreated from this at the last moment says something about the institutional difficulty of actually changing what a character is in a show that has been running for long enough that its character dynamics have become part of its identity. Sideshow Bob's scheming and failing is part of what The Simpsons is. Changing that requires changing something fundamental about the show's relationship to one of its most beloved recurring elements. The writers who wrote that ambivalent episode knew this. They pushed as far toward genuine change as the institutional context permitted. The retreat in the final act was not, probably, purely a creative choice. It was a negotiation between what the story demanded and what the show could accommodate. That negotiation, that particular kind of creative compromise between the best instinct and the institutional reality, is visible throughout the show's history with its secondary characters. Everyone who worked on the show at sufficient depth encountered the version of the story that the characters wanted to tell, and then had to negotiate that version into something the show's format, its network, its audience expectations, and its own accumulated history would permit. The gap between those two things, between what the characters wanted to be and what the show needed them to remain, is where much of the show's most interesting creative history lies. The loss of Phil Hartman, and the specific way the show handled that loss, says something important about the relationship between a show and the people who make it. The decision not to recast his characters was not a business decision in any obvious sense. Recasting would have been, if anything, more practical. The characters were useful, were beloved, and their absence created a gap in Springfield's secondary population that was genuinely felt. The decision not to recast was a statement about what Hartman had been to the show and about what the show owed to his memory. In an industry that typically replaces rather than retires, that recasts characters when business reasons require it, and treats the actor who originated the role as separable from the character itself, this choice was unusual. It honored something about the relationship between a performer and a character that most entertainment industry decisions do not honor. The choice acknowledged that Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz were not just characters the show owned, they were collaborations. They were the product of a specific meeting between a written role and a specific human being's voice and energy and timing. And without that human being, the collaboration was over. This recognition that some characters cannot be separated from the performers who created them is more widely understood in live theater than in animation or recorded media. In theater, you understand that what you are experiencing is the specific collaboration of this production, these actors, this moment in time, and that another production of the same play will be a different experience, rather than the same experience with different personnel. Recorded media tends not to think this way. It tends to treat the recording as the thing and the performer as the means of production. The Simpsons, with its decision about Hartman's characters, thought more like theater. It recognized that what Hartman had created was not replaceable, because the creation was not just the character, but the character as he existed in his hands. The Springfield that continued after 1998 was smaller for his absence. Not dramatically smaller, not in ways that most casual viewers consciously registered, but smaller in the sense that the specific quality of humor and warmth and barely contained absurdity that he brought to his characters was gone, and the space it had occupied remained. This kind of loss is not the kind that gets acknowledged in the way that dramatic story departures get acknowledged. No episode was written to address it. No character funeral was staged. The show simply moved forward with a Springfield that was different in texture from the one that had included him, and the texture difference was the memorial. The show's musical sophistication is most visible in the way it uses music to undercut its own comedy at specific moments, not to deflate jokes but to add a dimension to them. To suggest that beneath the comic surface of a scene, something emotional is also happening, and that the audience can feel both things simultaneously. This is an advanced technique in scoring. The standard approach to comedy scoring is to support the joke to match the music to the comedy's rhythm, to underscore the punchline, to use musical timing to reinforce the comedic timing. Clausen did this, and did it well. But he also, in the best moments of the show's best seasons, did something harder. He wrote music that was emotionally true to a scene's deeper meaning while the surface of the scene was playing for laughs. The result is a kind of stereo emotional experience. You laugh at what the scene is saying. You feel something about what the music is saying about it. And the two things together produce a third thing that is neither pure comedy nor pure emotion, but a specific combination that is only possible when both are present simultaneously. The Simpsons' ability to produce this combination, the laugh cry, the bittersweet, the funny sad, is one of its most distinctive qualities, and one that is most directly dependent on the quality of its music. This technique was developed most fully in the emotional episodes, the ones that are now most consistently cited in discussions of the show's peak achievements. The music in those episodes does not simply support the emotion, it precedes it. It arrives before the emotion is fully explicit in the scene, creating a kind of emotional anticipation that makes the full arrival of the feeling more powerful than it would have been without that preparation. Clausen understood, in other words, that music's relationship to narrative time is different from dialogue's relationship to narrative time. Dialogue is present tense. It happens in the moment it is spoken. Music can be future tense. It can arrive before the thing it is describing, establishing a register that the scene will then inhabit. He exploited this consistently in the episodes that required it, and the result is a body of work that holds up as music even completely separated from the images it was written to accompany. This is the final measure of any television scoring. Whether the music makes sense on its own, whether it has integrity as composition independent of its function as scoring. Most television music does not pass this test. It is functional in context and empty without it. The best of Clausen's work for The Simpsons is different. It is genuinely composed, in the full sense of the word, organized around musical logic rather than purely visual logic, making choices that serve the composition even when those choices are not the most immediately obvious choices from a purely functional perspective. This is the musical scandal that nobody talks about, not any lawsuit or controversy or rights dispute, but the simple fact that for 25 years, The Simpsons had one of the most undervalued composers in the history of American television working on its scoring, producing work of genuine artistic merit that was received by most of the critical community as background noise, as functional product, as the thing that happened while the jokes were being made. The jokes were extraordinary, the music was too. And the thing they made together, in the best episodes, was more than either of them separately. That is worth saying, clearly and finally, in any account of what the show actually achieved. There is one more musical element of the show that deserves extended discussion, which is the use of silence. Not the absence of music. Television scoring almost never employs genuine silence, but the strategic use of musical absence in moments where the show's emotional stakes are highest. The moments in The Simpsons that hit hardest are almost uniformly moments where the music stops, where the orchestral support withdraws and what remains is the voice, or sometimes just the image, without the emotional scaffolding that scoring provides. These moments are rare in the show's history, which is part of what makes them so effective. When a show that is almost always scored suddenly becomes quiet, the silence is felt as an event in itself. The absence of music becomes the music. The final scene of several of the show's most acclaimed episodes uses this technique. The scene plays out in something approaching silence, or with music so minimal as to be barely present, and the effect is to place the emotional weight of the moment entirely on the characters rather than on the score. The score cannot help them. The viewer cannot be cued by orchestral swells about how to feel. What is on screen is all there is, and the feeling that the scene produces must come from what is actually happening rather than from the musical direction telling you what to feel about it. This is more demanding than scored drama. It requires the writing, the performance, and the direction to do all the work that the music usually assists with. It requires the scene to be genuinely true rather than emotionally managed. And when it works, when the scene earns its silence and fills it with something real, the result is among the most affecting television comedy has ever produced. Alf Clausen understood the power of silence because he understood the power of music. You cannot know what absence means unless you know deeply what presence means. The choice to let a scene play without orchestral support is not a choice made in ignorance of what music would add. It is a choice made in full knowledge of that, and in the judgment that the scene is strong enough to stand without it, that the truth is there without assistance. The music of Springfield includes the silences. The moments when the orchestra stopped and the show simply existed, for a few seconds, as purely itself. Those moments are among the show's most honest. They are the places where the craft becomes invisible, and what remains is just the human thing the show was always, beneath the craft, trying to say. The voice acting of The Simpsons deserves at least a brief acknowledgement in any account of the show's scandals and secrets, because the voice cast has been, for the entirety of the show's run, one of its most significant and most underappreciated creative contributors. Dan Castellaneta's Homer, Julie Kavner's Marge, Nancy Cartwright's Bart, Yeardley Smith's Lisa. These are performances that span 36 years and represent something genuinely extraordinary in the history of voice acting. Not just technical excellence, though the technical excellence is real, but a sustained creative relationship with fictional characters that has no real parallel in the history of the medium. Castellaneta has been Homer Simpson for longer than most human relationships last. He has brought Homer through dozens of emotional registers, through hundreds of storylines, through the character's various evolutions and the show's various creative eras, maintaining a consistency that the audience recognizes as Homer, while also allowing the character to move through a range that would be challenging for any performer in any medium. The voice cast negotiations with Fox, particularly the famous 2004 negotiations in which cast members sought pay increases that were, at the time, widely reported as the largest in television history, were not simply about money. They were about the recognition that what the cast was doing was genuinely valuable, that 36 years of voice performance by the same people represented a creative achievement that had not previously been adequately compensated or acknowledged. The negotiations were ultimately resolved. The cast stayed, the show continued, but the episode of institutional history that the negotiations represent, the moment when the voices of Springfield had to argue for the recognition of what their voices were worth, is a document of the gap that often exists between the creative value of a performance and the institutional willingness to acknowledge that value as such. The characters of The Simpsons are inseparable from the voices that have inhabited them for their entire existence. Marge without Julie Kavner's voice would be a different character. Homer without Dan Castellaneta's voice, the specific quality of warmth and exasperation and childlike excitement that he brings to every reading, would be a fundamentally different person. The voice is not a delivery mechanism for the character. The voice is part of the character, constitutive of it, one of the elements from which the character is made. This is what the voice cast understood and what the negotiations were, at their core, about. The argument was not just about compensation. It was about the nature of what they were creating and the appropriate relationship between that creation and the institution that owned it. It was an argument that the show's best writers would have recognized and endorsed, because it was, fundamentally, an argument about artistic contribution and its recognition. The voices of Springfield belong to the characters now, in the public imagination. Dan Castellaneta is Homer. Julie Kavner is Marge. The performances have become inseparable from the figures they bring to life. That inseparability is the measure of an extraordinary creative achievement that spans 3.5 decades, and that deserves, in any honest accounting of the show, to be recognized as central to what The Simpsons is and has been. Section 12. The Treehouse of Horror Secrets. The Dark Mirror of Springfield. Every October, The Simpsons does something it ordinarily refuses to do. It kills its main characters. It lets them die in ways that are horrible, absurd, and occasionally genuinely frightening. It allows the show to be a different kind of thing for 22 minutes, something with menace in it, something with actual stakes, something that borrows the grammar of horror and science fiction, and uses it to say things about Springfield and about the Simpsons family that the regular episode format cannot accommodate. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have been running since the second season. There have been more than 30 of them. They are, in aggregate, one of the most sustained experiments in tonal range that any comedy series has ever attempted. A yearly reminder that the world the show inhabits can be much darker than its normal register suggests, that the characters are capable of much more than the regular episodes ask of them, and that the show has a relationship to horror and science fiction and dark fantasy that is not incidental to its identity, but central to what it has always been. Most discussions of the Treehouse of Horror episodes treat them as a kind of holiday special, a fun departure from the show's usual concerns, something to be enjoyed separately from the regular run rather than read as part of it. But this reading misses something important. The Treehouse of Horror segments are not departures from the show's concerns. They are distillations of them. They take the anxieties that the regular episodes handle through comedy and allow them to be stated directly, without the cushioning of humor, as the genuine sources of dread that they always were. The very first Treehouse of Horror segment from the second season set the template with a clarity that the show has been elaborating on ever since. It consisted of 3 stories told by the Simpson children in their treehouse on Halloween night, each drawn from a different horror or science fiction tradition. The first was a haunted house story. The second was a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, recited by Homer in an interpretation that was simultaneously reverent toward Poe and faithful to Homer's particular relationship to things he does not fully understand. The third was an alien abduction story. What these 3 segments have in common, beneath their very different surface treatments, is a single underlying concern: the home. The house that should be safe is terrifying. The literature of melancholy and loss, when absorbed by a man like Homer, becomes something he cannot quite process, but cannot entirely ignore. The family, taken from their home, must find their way back to it. Every Treehouse of Horror segment that has followed is, at some level, about the same things: the home's fragility, the family's vulnerability to forces outside their control, the particular horror of discovering that the world you live in, the one you thought you understood, the one you organized your life around, operates by different rules than the ones you were given. That the comfort of the familiar was always a negotiation, never a guarantee. These are the same concerns that animate the regular episodes. The Treehouse of Horror simply removes the comedy that usually diffuses them. When the regular episode has Homer survive something that should kill him, the show's humor maintains a specific distance from the genuine terror of mortality that the situation technically involves. When the Halloween special has Homer die, and he dies in the Treehouse of Horror segments, with considerable frequency and considerable creativity, the distance collapses. The death is played for its own sake, for the pleasure of the genre, but also for the brief, genuine acknowledgement that these characters are mortal in a way the regular show almost never allows. This annual act of acknowledging mortality, even in a context that is explicitly marked as not canonical, not real, not part of the show's official continuity, is more meaningful than it might appear. It says that the show knows what it is usually refusing, that the immortality of the regular episode format, the reset, the recovery, the eternal return is a choice, not a fact. That Springfield's characters could die, that they could be lost, that the house on Evergreen Terrace is not a permanent condition but a fragile arrangement maintained by luck and love, and the particular mercy of a show that has decided, as a matter of creative policy, to keep them alive. The Treehouse of Horror is the show's annual reminder that this decision is a decision, that it could have been made differently, that the version of the show where things are permitted to end is always just one choice away. The most disturbing Treehouse of Horror segments are not the ones with the most graphic content. They are the ones that come closest to the show's real concerns, the ones that use horror's language to describe something that the regular show circles around without directly naming. There is a segment, in one of the middle seasons, that depicts the family in a world where television itself is the monster. Not literally, the horror genre allows for literal monster television, and the show has done that too. But in this segment, the horror is more subtle. The television is watching the family as much as the family is watching it. The relationship between the viewer and the viewed is reversed, and the result is a depiction of media consumption that the regular show's satire addresses obliquely, but the horror segment can address directly. The fear that you are not watching the screen so much as the screen is watching you, that you are being shaped and directed by what you consume in ways you cannot fully see because you are inside the consumption. This is not a comfortable observation for a television show to make about itself. But the Treehouse of Horror format provides the necessary distance. The horror anthology frame says, "This is a story, not a statement. You are allowed to be disturbed by it without being required to take it as the show's position. The horror frame creates a kind of plausible deniability that the regular episode format cannot provide. The show has used this deniability with remarkable consistency across more than 30 years of Halloween specials. The Treehouse of Horror is where the show is allowed to be most honest about its own anxieties about mortality, about the fragility of the family unit, about the relationship between entertainment and manipulation, about the specific horror of being trapped in a loop that you have no power to break. These are the show's deepest concerns, stated in their most direct form, in the one context where directness is protected by the genre frame. The most quoted observation about the Treehouse of Horror segments is that they are the show's way of letting off steam, of releasing the pressure that accumulates from 36 years of maintained optimism, of showing the dark version of Springfield so that the regular version can continue to be the light one. This is partly right, but it misses the direction of the relationship between the formats. The Treehouse of Horror segments do not just release pressure from the regular show, they inform the regular show. They remind you, as a viewer, of what the show is choosing not to do when it chooses to have Homer recover from another impossible injury, when it chooses to have the family reunited after another crisis, when it chooses the reset over the conclusion. The annual Halloween reminder that the show could be darker, could be final, could let things end, is what makes the show's ongoing choice to not do those things meaningful rather than merely convenient. Every time the regular show refuses to age its characters, or refuses to let a crisis have permanent consequences, or refuses to honor the natural trajectory of a story that has been building toward conclusion, every one of those refusals is made more legible by the Treehouse of Horror, which demonstrates that the show knows what a conclusion would look like and is choosing something else. The choice is conscious. The horror special is the evidence. There are also specific Treehouse of Horror segments that contain, within their explicitly non-canonical frames, things that are more true about the show's characters than almost anything in the regular episodes. The psychological horror segments, the ones that use the genre to explore what a character fears at a level deeper than their usual concerns, sometimes achieve a kind of portrait that the regular show's format cannot accommodate. A segment that places Lisa in a nightmare scenario of social isolation and academic failure, rendered as horror, says something about her character's deepest fears that the regular show handles only through comedy. In the horror frame, the comedy is absent. What remains is the genuine vulnerability of a child who is always the smartest person in the room and who has understood, long before most children would, that being the smartest person in the room is not the same as being the most valued person in the room. That intelligence without acceptance is its own particular loneliness. That the thing that makes her special is the same thing that makes her isolated. The show cannot say this directly in the regular episode format. It would be too sad, too specific, too unresolvable in the comedy frame. But the horror segment, which is allowed to be sad and specific and unresolvable, can say it. And in saying it, it adds a layer to the character that the regular show benefits from, even though it never acknowledges that the horror segment happened. This is the secret function of the Treehouse of Horror. Not just a holiday treat, not just a genre exercise, but the place where the show can be honest about things. It spends the rest of the year being honest about only sideways through comedy, through exaggeration, through the distance that the regular format provides. The horror special removes the distance. Just for those 22 minutes, just in the context of a story that is explicitly marked as not real. Just enough to say the true thing before the distance reasserts itself and the reset button is pressed and everything goes back to normal. Springfield is a horror story that has decided to be a comedy. The Treehouse of Horror is the show remembering this annually with great affection and considerable craft. Section 13. The Strange Afterlife of Beloved Simpsons Writers. The Simpsons did something unusual in the history of American television. It trained a generation of writers who then went out into the broader entertainment landscape and changed it. The Harvard Lampoon pipeline that fed so much of the early show's writing talent produced alumni who moved into film, into other television shows, into podcasting, into publishing, and carried with them a specific set of skills and a specific understanding of comedy that had been developed, at least in part, inside the Springfield writers' room. This is not entirely unusual. Successful shows have always produced successful alumni. Saturday Night Live, for instance, has been the training ground for more significant comedy careers than any other single institution in American entertainment. The show functions as a factory for a specific kind of performer, and the performers who emerge from it carry a recognizable set of qualities developed during their time there. What makes the Simpsons alumni unusual is the degree to which they have consistently credited the show with teaching them something specific about comedy, something that was not available elsewhere, that the show's particular demands and particular standards developed in ways that their previous experience had not. The thing they most consistently describe learning is not technique in the narrow sense. It is not joke structure or story architecture, though those things were taught and learned. It is something more fundamental, the habit of asking whether a piece of comedy is honest, whether it is saying something true about the human situation it is depicting, or whether it is simply being clever without really meaning anything. This is a harder question than it sounds. Clever comedy is achievable. Honest comedy is much rarer. And the difference between them is something that the early Simpsons writers' room, at its best, consistently insisted upon. A joke that was merely clever that worked as a construction without being grounded in something real would be pushed until it became honest, or discarded. The standard was not just funny, it was true. This standard is visible in the subsequent work of the show's alumni. Writers who came from The Simpsons and moved on to their own shows have consistently produced work that aspires to the same combination comedy that is also honest, humor that is inseparable from genuine emotional engagement with its subjects. The standard they absorbed in the Springfield writers' room did not leave when they did. But the show's creative legacy also has a shadow side, which is the degree to which the particular sensibility that The Simpsons developed smart, satirical, ironically distanced, confident in its own intelligence became the dominant register of American prestige comedy in the years following the show's golden era. A generation of writers trained in the Simpsons mode went out and made television that was Simpsons-influenced in ways both acknowledged and unacknowledged. The result was a period in American comedy television where The Simpsons' particular qualities, the cultural reference density, the ironic layering, the sophisticated cynical worldview became so dominant that they defined what smart comedy was supposed to look like. This is both a tribute to the show's influence and a limitation of it. When a single sensibility dominates a field, it tends to suppress alternatives. The comedy that did not look like The Simpsons was, for a period, less likely to be produced or celebrated because the institutional and critical vocabulary for evaluating comedy had been built around The Simpsons model. Shows that were smart in different ways, that had different emotional registers, that used comedy to get at truth by routes that did not pass through The Simpsons' particular neighborhood, were harder to see and harder to champion. The writers who made things that were genuinely different, who refused The Simpsons' particular ironic register, who found comedy in directness rather than in sophisticated distance, who developed voices that owed nothing to the Springfield model, often found themselves working against the current rather than with it. Their work was harder to place, harder to sell, harder to get critical attention for, because the critical framework for evaluating comedy had been so thoroughly shaped by the show that was, by most assessments, the best comedy ever made. This is the specific, strange, mixed nature of the show's legacy in the entertainment industry. It raised the standards of what comedy could be. It also, through the dominance of its influence, narrowed the definition of what comedy was allowed to be. Both things are true. Both are part of the honest accounting. The show's direct alumni, the writers who worked there and moved on, have handled this legacy in different ways. Some have worked consciously within the tradition, refining and developing the Simpsons model in their subsequent work. Others have worked consciously against it, using their understanding of what The Simpsons did to do something deliberately different. A few have managed to do both simultaneously, which is the hardest thing and the most interesting. What none of them has done is forget it. The writers' room that was at its best a place of extraordinary creative pressure and extraordinary creative achievement is not the kind of place that graduates forget. For better and worse. For the comedy it made possible and the comedy it made harder. For the standard it set and the standard it sometimes enforced too exclusively. The Springfield writers' room shaped American comedy in ways that will be visible in the work it produced and the work that came after it for decades to come. Springfield trained people to care about truth in comedy. This is its most significant and most enduring contribution to the form, and the people it trained carry that standard with them into every room they subsequently entered, as both a gift and a responsibility. Section 14. The Simpsons and the Internet, a love story with complications. The relationship between The Simpsons and the internet is one of the most significant and least examined stories in the show's history. Not just in the obvious sense the show being discussed, analyzed, and quoted online since the internet became a mass medium, but in the deeper sense of how the internet's existence has changed the show, changed the audience's relationship to it, and changed what it means to be a Simpsons fan in ways that nobody in 1989 could have predicted. The show preceded the consumer internet. Its first few seasons were produced, aired, and received in a media landscape where the primary venues for audience response were television ratings, letters written to the network, and conversations between people who happened to know other people who watched the same shows. The show had no way to track what the audience thought about specific scenes or specific character choices in anything approaching real time. The feedback loop between production and audience was measured in months, not hours, and was filtered through a small number of institutional intermediaries, critics, ratings, services, network executives, rather than being directly available to the people who were making the show. Then the internet arrived, and the feedback loop changed. The early Simpsons online communities, Usenet groups, fan forums, the early websites that served as repositories for episode guides and trivia databases established something new in the relationship between a television show and its audience. They demonstrated that a significant portion of the show's audience was watching with a level of attention and engagement that the show's creators had not anticipated. They were catching continuity errors. They were tracking recurring background characters. They were developing theories about the show's internal logic. They were, in short, treating the show as an object worthy of the same kind of close reading that had previously been reserved for literature and film. This was, for the show's creators, initially flattering and increasingly complicated. Flattering because it confirmed that the show was being taken seriously in ways that distinguished it from most television. Complicated because the fans who were paying this level of attention were also, inevitably, catching things that the show's creators had not intended to be caught. The online fan community discovered many of the things discussed in this script: the background character patterns, the recurring visual jokes, the ways the show's symbolism and structure contained meanings that were not stated in the dialogue, not through any specific promotional effort by the show, but through the simple application of sustained attention. They watched the same episodes multiple times. They compared notes. They built databases of information. They developed analytical frameworks that the show's creators found, in some cases, more illuminating than anything the show's own production team had generated. This created a genuinely unusual dynamic. The show began to exist in two parallel spaces simultaneously. The version that aired on television, received by a general audience in the way that television was normally received, and the version that was being developed, annotated, and theorized online by a community of extremely engaged viewers. The two versions of the show were not the same. The online community's version was richer, more densely layered, more aware of its own history and its own implications. The show began to respond to this community in ways that were not always acknowledged as responses. In-jokes that were clearly aimed at viewers who had been paying close attention. Callbacks to episodes that a casual viewer would not have remembered. Moments that only made full sense if you had been reading the fan commentary, if you had been following the discussions, if you were part of the community that was watching the show as something more than entertainment. This was generosity toward an audience that had invested in the show. But it was also something with a more complicated quality, the beginning of a relationship between the show and its most engaged viewers, where the show was partly making itself for them rather than for the broader audience, where the reference density, the in-joke architecture, the assumption of viewer knowledge were calibrated for people who had done their homework, rather than for the casual viewer who was just tuning in for the first time. This shift did not happen overnight and was never absolute. The show continued to produce content that worked for the general audience, that did not require specialized knowledge, that was accessible in the way that network television was supposed to be accessible. But the presence of the fan community and the show's awareness of the fan community did alter the texture of what was being produced. It made the show more knowing, more referential, more conscious of itself as an object with a history that its most engaged viewers were tracking carefully. The internet also transformed the relationship between the show and its failures in ways that had significant effects on how the show was made. Before the internet, an episode that was poorly received had a limited half-life. Critics would review it. Viewers would discuss it with their friends. The show would move on, the discussion would fade, and the episode would become part of the show's history rather than an ongoing subject of commentary. With the internet, poor episodes became permanent. They were archived, documented, discussed, and returned to. Specific creative decisions that were criticized when they aired were still being criticized decades later. The Armin Tamzarian episode, discussed at length in this script, is perhaps the most prominent example, an episode that aired in 1997, and that is still, in 2025, regularly cited in discussions of the show's failures, because the internet gave that criticism a permanence that would not have been possible in the pre-internet era. This permanence is not without value. It is, among other things, a form of accountability. If a show makes a creative decision that is genuinely wrong, that fails its own standards, that betrays its audience's trust in some meaningful way, the internet's insistence on memory ensures that the failure cannot simply be swept under the rug of forward momentum. It stays part of the record. But the permanence is also, for the people who make the show, a specific kind of pressure that did not exist before. The awareness that every creative decision they make will be immediately and permanently evaluated, that the evaluation will be visible and persistent, that a single failure might define years of a show's reputation. This awareness shapes the creative risk-taking in ways that are not always productive. It can make writers more cautious, more defensive of their existing achievements, less willing to take the risks that produce the show's most interesting work. The best creative decisions are often ones that do not look like safe bets in advance. The episodes that have become most beloved, the ones that defined the show's achievement, that demonstrated what the show could be at its finest, were often episodes that represented someone in the room deciding to try something that might not work. The internet's insistence on documenting failures creates an environment where the calculation around that kind of risk is different from what it was when failures faded with time. The show that exists today exists in a media environment that is fundamentally different from the one in which it began. The audience's relationship to it is different. The accountability it faces is different. The tools that audiences have for engaging with it, for archiving it, for theorizing about it, for applying sustained critical attention to it, are all different and all more powerful than anything that existed in 1989. And yet the show continues. The same family on the same couch in the same house, navigating an audience relationship that has become infinitely more complex and infinitely more attentive than anything the show's creators imagined when they first put The Simpsons on that couch 36 years ago. The internet did not make The Simpsons what it is, but it profoundly changed what being a Simpsons fan means, what it means to watch the show, what it means for the show to succeed or fail in any given moment. The show now exists inside a feedback loop that is immediate, that is permanent, and that is operated by people who are watching more carefully than any show in 1989 had any reason to expect would happen. Whether the show has fully adapted to this new environment, whether it has found a way to make the internet's sustained attention productive rather than merely constraining, is a question that does not have a settled answer. The internet giveth, and the internet archiveth, and the show, like all long-running institutions that have survived the transition from a pre-internet to a post-internet world, is still working out what it means to be known this well, by this many people, in this much detail. Section 15. The thing nobody says about Marge. There is a conversation that has been happening around The Simpsons for at least 20 years, in fan forums and academic papers and casual discussions about the show's quality and legacy, and it is a conversation about Homer. About whether he has gotten stupider over the years. About whether the escalation of his incompetence across the show's run represents a genuine character shift or simply an accommodation of the demands of a different kind of comedy. About what it means that the character who was, in the show's early seasons, a portrait of a specific kind of limited but genuine human being has become, in the later seasons, increasingly a delivery mechanism for extreme physical comedy. This is a legitimate and important conversation. But it has a shadow that nobody discusses as much, and the shadow is the conversation about Marge. Because while Homer has changed dramatically across the show's run, in ways that are visible and well documented and widely discussed, Marge has changed in a different way, not dramatically, not in ways that any single fan could easily point to and say, here, this is where Marge changed. She has changed through a kind of drift, a slow, consistent deprioritization that has occurred so gradually and so consistently that it is hard to see any single moment as the turning point. In the show's early seasons, Marge Simpson was one of the most carefully written female characters in American television comedy. This is not hyperbole. The episodes that centered on her experience, her frustrations, her ambitions, Her complicated love for a man who was never going to be the partner she might have imagined herself with in her younger years were produced with a care and an emotional honesty that was exceptional. They took her seriously. They gave her interiority that the show's format rarely gave any character, let alone a supporting character, let alone a wife. There are specific early Marge episodes that demonstrate this. Episodes where she confronts something about her own life that she has been refusing to confront, an ambition she has suppressed, a frustration she has been containing, a truth about her marriage or her choices that she can no longer maintain the comfortable distance from. These episodes were not always comfortable to watch. They were not designed to make the audience feel good about the way things were. They were designed to be honest, and honesty, in this case, required acknowledging that Marge's life was not exactly what she would have chosen. This kind of honesty is rare in television depictions of wives and mothers, because the genre framework of the family sitcom tends to require that the family unit, whatever its individual discontents, remain intact and recognizably good. The show that honestly depicts a mother's ambivalence toward her own domestic life runs the risk of implying that the domestic life is not worth having, which is a risk that the format's commercial logic is reluctant to take. The early Simpsons took this risk. The episodes that are honest about Marge's complicated feelings about her circumstances are better for having taken it. They produce comedy that is genuinely surprising comedy, that earns its laughs by going somewhere uncomfortable before it finds its way to the joke, and they produce emotional moments that the show's regular format cannot achieve through gentler routes. But across the show's run, this willingness to take the risk with Marge decreased. The episodes that center on her experience became, over time, more likely to affirm her situation rather than examine it. More likely to end with Marge confirming that she loves her family and loves her life, rather than acknowledging the complexity and the ambivalence and the specific quality of love that includes knowing what you gave up. More likely to use her as a stabilizing force for Homer's escalating chaos than as a character with her own story. This drift is not catastrophic. The show has continued to produce good Marge episodes. She remains a fully present character, not a piece of furniture. But the particular quality of honest examination that the best early Marge episodes achieved, the quality that made her one of the most interesting female characters in the history of television comedy, has been less consistently present in the later seasons. The honesty has been softened, the complexity has been smoothed. Why this happened is not entirely clear from the outside. The most likely explanation involves the interplay between the show's shifting creative priorities and the structural demands of its format. As the show moved toward more extreme physical comedy and more surreal plotting, Marge's role as the family's emotional anchor became more important to the show's function. She needed to be the stable thing, the reliable thing, the character whose consistency provided the base against which Homer's escalating craziness could be measured. This structural role is incompatible with the honest examination of her own ambivalence. A character cannot simultaneously be the audience's emotional fixed point and the subject of genuine uncertainty. This is a real constraint, and it is a constraint the show encountered organically rather than by design. But the result is that Marge has, over decades, become somewhat less than what she was in the show's best years. Not a worse character, exactly, but a more limited one. A character who has been defined increasingly by her function rather than by her fullness. The thing nobody says about Marge is that she deserved better in the later seasons than the show gave her. That the character the early seasons were building toward a woman whose love for her family was real and whose complexity was equally real, who was allowed to be both the heart of the family and a person with an interiority that exceeded that function, was a character that the show's structural evolution made increasingly difficult to sustain. The early Marge was building towards something. You could feel it in the episodes, the sense of a portrait developing, adding complexity with each season, moving toward a fullness that was going to be something the show had not previously achieved in any character. Then the structural demands of the show's evolving format intervened. The development slowed. The fullness that was building was redirected into stability. What Marge might have become if the show had followed its own best instincts for her character through its entire run is one of Springfield's most interesting, unanswered questions. Not because what she became is bad, she is still one of the most carefully rendered characters the show has ever produced. But because the version that was being built in seasons 3 through 6 suggested something that would have been extraordinary, and the gap between that suggestion and what was ultimately delivered is the quiet, unmarked, almost entirely undiscussed tragedy of one of American television's most important female characters. Section 16. the show that refused to end, and what that actually costs. Every conversation about The Simpsons that has happened in the last 15 years eventually arrives at the same place. The question of when and whether the show should end. It is a question the show itself has addressed, in various forms, more than once. Episodes that play with the idea of cancellation, episodes that imagine Springfield's future in ways that acknowledge the character's mortality, the various negotiations over the years in which the possibility of the show ending was raised as a real prospect rather than an abstract one. The show has not ended. It continues, with no announced conclusion date, into its fourth decade. And the arguments about whether this continued existence is something to celebrate or something to mourn are genuine arguments not about quality in the narrow sense, but about what it means for a creative work to outlast the conditions that produced it. The case for the show's continued existence is straightforward. It is still watched by millions of people. It still produces episodes that are, by the standards of most television comedy, genuinely good, funnier than most alternatives, more carefully made, more consistently entertaining. The people who work on it care about what they are making. The characters are beloved in ways that make their continued presence a source of genuine pleasure for their audience. There is real value in the simple fact of The Simpsons existing, in the house on Evergreen Terrace being lit, in the familiar music playing, and the couch gag running and the episode beginning. The pleasure of the familiar is real and legitimate and not to be dismissed. The case against continued existence is harder to make because it requires arguing against something that people love, and arguing against something people love always feels like an act of aggression rather than an act of critical honesty. But the case is real. The cost of the show's continued existence is paid primarily by its own legacy. Every episode that airs in the current era of the show exists in a context where it is being compared to the golden era, and the comparison is not favorable and cannot be favorable because the conditions that produced the golden era were specific to that era and cannot be reproduced. The writers who made seasons 3 through 8 were people at particular moments in their creative development, working in a particular cultural context, operating under particular pressures that produced a particular kind of excellence. That specific confluence of factors cannot be recreated. Trying to recreate it produces something that is recognizably good, but that exists under the shadow of the thing it is being compared to. Every season of The Simpsons that airs after the golden era adds another chapter to the comparison. The current show is not the show that produced Marge vs. The Monorail or Last Exit to Springfield or Cape Fear. This is not a criticism of the people currently making the show. It is a statement about what time does to creative work and what the show's continued existence does to the perception of what the show is. There is also a specific cost to the characters themselves, a cost that is harder to articulate because it is emotional rather than practical. Homer Simpson, as he exists in the current era of the show, is a different character from Homer Simpson as he existed in seasons 3 through 8. The differences are not dramatic. He is recognizably Homer, with Homer's voice and Homer's outline and Homer's essential qualities. But something in the center of him has been eroded by the accumulation of episodes, by the demands of a different kind of comedy, by the structural pressures of a format that has had to sustain the same character for 36 years. The Homer of the golden era was, at his best, heartbreaking in a specific way. His limitations were real limitations. His love was real love. His failures were genuine failures rather than comedic set pieces. He was a person who wanted things and could not always get them, and kept trying in the face of that failure, and the comedy came from the specific quality of a man who is more limited than his desires and less limited than his worst days suggest. The Homer of the current era is still funny, still warm, still lovable in the particular way that Homer has always been lovable, but the heartbreak is less accessible. The limitations are more comedic than real. The portrait has flattened somewhat, from the three-dimensional complexity of the early character to something that retains the shape of the original but has lost some of the weight. This is what the show's continued existence costs. Not the current episode's quality in isolation, which remains solid, but the ongoing revision of our understanding of who these characters are. The accumulated later season Homer shapes how we understand Homer now, and the shape he has settled into in the later seasons is a slightly reduced version of the one he was building toward in his best years. An ending a real one, a crafted one that honored what the show had been and what the characters had been, would have prevented this. would have fixed the characters at their highest point of development, preserved their fullest versions, allowed the show's legacy to be evaluated against what it was at its peak rather than against the long, gradual, affectionate decline that continued existence has produced. Endings are harder than continuations. They require saying, "This is what the story was, and here is what it means, and now it is finished." They require the same courage that the best episodes required the courage to go somewhere uncomfortable, to honor the truth of what the story has been, to resist the pressure of all the reasons to keep going. The Simpsons has produced some of the most genuinely courageous television comedy ever made. It has also, by continuing past the point where courage would require ending, produced something that is both testament to that courage and evidence of its limits. The show that was brave enough to say everything it had to say within the space of a single episode was not ultimately brave enough to stop saying it when the saying was done. This is not a simple failure. It is a complicated one, shaped by institutional pressures and commercial realities, and the genuine love that the people who make the show have for what they are making. It is the failure of something that is also, in its own way, a kind of love. The family that will not let the story end, because ending means losing something real. The Simpsons will end eventually. All things end. And when it does, whenever that is, the accounting of what it was will have to include both the extraordinary run of its golden years and the long, warm, imperfect, loving extension of its later ones. Both are part of what the show is. Neither can be dismissed. But the ending, when it comes, will be a gift to the legacy. It will fix the show at the moment of its conclusion, rather than allowing it to continue accumulating the sediment of seasons that are good, but lesser than the best. It will say, "This is what it was. All of it. From the first couch gag to the last. The whole strange, brilliant, flawed, generous, honest, occasionally dishonest, deeply human record of a family in a town in a show that lasted longer than anyone expected and meant more than anyone planned. The show that refused to end has given us everything it had, and everything it had was extraordinary. What it owes us now, whenever the debt comes due, is the end. Crafted and honest and worthy of what came before it, the last couch gag. The last opening credits. The last time the family sits down together in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the town that was never quite anywhere, in the story that was always about something more than the family itself. When that ending comes, Springfield will be quiet, and the quiet will be the measure of how much it mattered. Section 17. Small truths. The details that slipped through. There are details scattered across 36 seasons of The Simpsons that do not belong to any single theory or scandal. They are just details. Small observations that were placed in the show with such casualness that most viewers never registered them, and that, when examined carefully, reveal something precise and true about the world Springfield was depicting. Homer Simpson, in one of the show's middle seasons, is shown at work at the nuclear plant. He is not doing anything dramatic. He is sitting at his console, eating, watching the dials. In the background, barely visible, there is a framed photograph on his workstation. It is not a photograph of Marge. It is not a photograph of his children. It is a photograph of a donut. This detail is there for perhaps 2 seconds. It is never commented on. The camera does not linger. And yet it is one of the most precisely observed details in the show's history. A small, accurate portrait of a man whose relationship to comfort food is not a cartoon exaggeration, but a genuine dependency, something that has become, in the context of his life, as important as the people he loves. These small details accumulate throughout the show's history into something larger than their individual significance. They are the evidence that the show, even when it was not being actively brilliant, was paying attention. That someone in the production was always making the choice to include the specific thing rather than the general thing, the true detail rather than the convenient one. Springfield's geography contains hundreds of these details. Streets named after groaning family members, businesses whose names are puns that work on multiple levels. Visible background elements in crowd scenes that tell stories the camera never visits. A show running for 36 years in a specific fictional world develops a texture of detail that is impossible to exhaustively document and equally impossible, once noticed, to stop noticing. The details matter because they are the show's commitment to its own world. They are the evidence that Springfield was being treated as a real place by the people who made it, not just as a backdrop for jokes, but as a space that had its own logic, its own history, its own accumulated specificity. The detail that nobody will notice is also, paradoxically, the most important detail, because it demonstrates that the commitment to the world does not stop at the boundary of what the audience can see. It goes further. It goes into the spaces where nobody is looking. And that quality, the quality of a creative work that maintains its standards in the places where no one will check, is what distinguishes great work from merely good work. The Simpsons, at its best, put the photograph of the donut on Homer's workstation. Nobody had to. Nobody would have noticed its absence. It was there because someone cared enough to make it true, even in the corner of the frame, even for 2 seconds, even in an episode about something else entirely. That care, multiplied across 36 years and 800 episodes and thousands of scenes and tens of thousands of frames, is what the show actually is. Not the theories, not the scandals, not the controversies or the negotiations or the creative conflicts. Those are real and important and worth examining. But beneath all of them, as the foundation of everything else, is that care. The particular quality of attention that a great creative work brings to its own world, in the small things as much as the large ones, in the background as much as the foreground, in the detail nobody will notice as much as in the joke everybody will. That is the real Springfield. The place where someone put the photograph of the donut on Homer's workstation because it was true, because Homer would have that photograph. Because that is exactly who Homer is, and if you are going to depict Homer Simpson's workstation, you might as well depict it honestly, in all the small ways that honesty requires. The show that did that, consistently, across its best years, was extraordinary. The legacy of that extraordinary work is what we carry with us from Springfield. Not the scandals that nobody talks about, though those are real, but the truths that nobody stops to notice, the small ones, the specific ones, the ones in the corner of the frame that were put there because the people who made the show cared enough to make them true. That is the final thing to say about The Simpsons. Not that it was long, not that it was complicated, not that it was influential or controversial or beloved.